What if the beginning of human history is only the part that survived in clay? That question waits quietly inside the broken tablets of ancient Mesopotamia. It waits in museum drawers, in excavation reports, in fragments copied by ancient scribes whose hands have been dust for thousands of years. The Sumerians left behind lists, hymns, temple records, myths, and strange stories of the Anunnaki, those high beings who appear not only as gods, but as judges, overseers, rulers, and keepers of order. And there is the first quiet contradiction. The earliest civilization we can clearly read does not speak as if it is inventing the world from nothing. It often speaks as if it is remembering a world already arranged. This is the central mystery you enter now. Sumer is often called the first civilization, with its cities, writing, temples, kings, canals, administrators, and measured fields. Yet its own stories seem to reach backward into a time before named history. Before the first cities we can excavate with confidence, before the clay record becomes steady beneath the hands of historians, the record is fragmentary. It should be treated carefully. Scholars do not read these tablets as simple historical diaries. They are myth, theology, royal memory, temple tradition, political imagination, and sometimes old explanations wrapped in sacred language. Yet if you listen slowly, not as someone hunting for certainty, but as someone following a faint trail through dust, Sumer begins to feel less like a beginning and more like a doorway. Behind that doorway, something older breathes. You stand in the mind's eye, not the start of civilization, but at the edge of a question. A clay tablet lies before you, small enough to hold in the palm. Its surface is marked with wedge-shaped signs pressed by a reed stylus. Some lines are clear, others are broken away, a corner is missing, and with it perhaps a name, a number, or a phrase that would have made the whole sentence less mysterious. That is the strange beauty of Mesopotamian evidence. It speaks, but not completely. The archaeologist finds the clay. The museum preserves it. The Assyriologist compares the signs. The historian places it among other texts. Slowly, a translation appears. But even then, the tablet does not become simple. It belongs to a world where gods could own cities, rivers could answer to divine order, kingship could descend from heaven, and human labour could be described as part of a cosmic arrangement. It is tempting to smile at such ideas from a modern distance. Ancient people, we sometimes think, explained everything with gods because they lacked modern science. That is partly true, but it is also too easy. The Sumerians were not careless dreamers sitting in mud-brick shadows. They measured land, they counted grain, they organised workers, they tracked offerings, they shaped canals through difficult landscapes. They developed record-keeping because memory alone was not enough. They were practical, and that makes their myths more interesting, not less. Because when practical people preserve strange stories, the stories deserve patient attention, not blind belief, not dismissal either. Something in them mattered enough to copy, teach, recite, adapt, and carry forward into Akkadian, Babylonian, and later traditions. The old names shifted, the languages changed, yet the memory remained. One of the most curious features of Sumerian tradition is that it often places the true origin of order outside ordinary human invention. Kingship descends, the plans of temples are revealed, the great gods assign roles, the Anunnaki gather, judge, decree, and arrange the conditions of life. Human beings do not simply wake one morning and decide to build civilization. In many of these stories, civilization arrives through a structure already imagined by powers above humanity. For a cautious historian, this reflects sacred kingship and temple ideology. Cities needed legitimacy, and divine stories gave that legitimacy weight. A ruler was not just powerful, he was authorized. A temple was not just a building, it was the household of a god. A field was not merely soil, it belonged within a sacred economy. That explanation is strong, grounded, and useful. Still, a softer question remains. Why do these first written traditions sound so often like memories of inheritance? Why do they describe not merely creation, but organization? Why do gods in the earliest records feel, at times, less like distant stars and more like administrators of an old system? There is no need to force the answer. The clay does not allow that. You let the question rest while the world around it begins to form. The land is southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers spread through flat alluvial plains before reaching marsh and gulf. The soil is rich but demanding. Water brings life, and water also destroys. Fields need canals. Canals need labour. Labour needs coordination. Coordination needs authority. Authority needs memory. At first, that memory lives in bodies and voices. Then it enters marks, tokens, seals, and clay. Long before a tablet preserves a myth about gods and kings, small clay tokens help people count goods. Seals mark ownership and movement. Administrative habits grow from simple needs: sheep, barley, oil, beer, labour days, temple rations. All of them must be remembered. Slowly, in a way both ordinary and astonishing, writing begins not as poetry, but as accounting. This is one of the quiet surprises of Sumer. The first writing is not born from a desire to tell beautiful stories. It begins with the practical pressure of keeping track. A civilization must remember what it owes itself. Yet the moment writing becomes possible, older voices begin to enter it. Hymns, myths, lists, royal claims, and sacred traditions find their way into signs. Clay becomes more than storage. It becomes a vessel for time. And time, in Sumer, is not always neat. Some stories speak of ages before the flood. Some lists give kings' reigns so long they seem to belong to mythic duration rather than ordinary politics. Some traditions place wisdom, kingship, crafts, law, and social order in a world that begins before human history becomes readable. Scholars debate how these materials should be interpreted. Are they symbolic, political, theological? Echoes of real memories stretch through oral tradition? They may be all of these at once. That is where the mystery stays alive. Not because the tablets prove that another advanced civilization stood behind Sumer in some simple way. They do not. The evidence is incomplete, and careful reading matters. But the tablets do show that the Sumerians imagined their world as the visible surface of something older. They believed, or at least wrote, that human order had roots beyond human memory. And perhaps that is the gentlest way to approach the idea that the first civilization was never truly first, not as a claim shouted into darkness, but as a question placed beside a lamp. What came before the part we can read? Outside the imagined tablet room, the evening cools. The smell of wet clay lingers on the air. A reed stylus rests beside a drying tablet. Somewhere beyond the mud brick walls, insects murmur near dark water, and temple steps hold the last warmth of the day. The city feels new to history, but old to itself. You stay with that feeling. Sumer may be the first civilization whose voice reaches us clearly through writing. Yet the voice itself seems to speak from a deeper chamber. It tells of gods who organized, kingship that descended, cities that were chosen, humans who were formed for labor, and memories broken by flood and time. The first thing you learn from the clay is not an answer. It is a pause. And inside that pause, the beginning of history becomes less like a line and more like a buried foundation, with one visible wall rising above the sand and other stones still hidden below. The dust of a southern Mesopotamian city does not rise like the dust of an empty place. It rises from footsteps, carts, animals, brick moulds, canal banks, and courtyards where people are already busy before the white heat of noon. You feel it settle softly against your skin as you move through a city that seems, at first glance, too organized to be young. That is one of the quiet puzzles of early Sumer. When the great cities of southern Mesopotamia become visible to archaeology, they do not appear as simple villages slowly learning how to become urban. They appear with temple platforms, storage rooms, workshops, clay ceilings, ration systems, long-distance materials, and a social world already divided into roles. There are farmers, herders, fishers, potters, builders, administrators, priests, and labourers. There are people who shape clay into bricks, and people who shape clay into records. It feels sudden. Of course, it was not truly sudden. Archaeology shows long development through earlier cultures in Mesopotamia, including the Ubaid and Uruk periods. Villages grew, irrigation became more complex, temples expanded, pottery styles changed, settlements formed wider networks. Nothing human becomes a city overnight, no matter how dramatic a myth may sound by torchlight. Still, the visible result has a strange completeness. You enter Uruk as a place of noise and management. The city is not just houses gathered together, it is a living system. Mud brick walls catch the light. Narrow passages guide people between work areas. Storage jars line shaded rooms. The scent of grain dust mixes with bitumen, sweat, animal hides, and reed smoke. Somewhere, a clerk presses signs into damp clay, not for beauty, but because someone must know how much barley has moved from one hand to another. The city remembers through work. Uruk becomes one of the largest urban centres of its age, and its influence spreads across much of the ancient Near East. Its monumental precincts show an ability to organise labour on a scale far beyond a small village. Its beveled rim bowls, cylinder seals, and administrative tablets point toward mass distribution and control. The details are debated, but the impression remains strong. By the time the city stands fully in the record, it already behaves like a machine made of humans. Gods. Grain and clay? Here's the attention peak. Quiet but sharp. The earliest cities do not simply give us streets and walls, they give us bureaucracy. That may sound less romantic than lost gods, but bureaucracy is one of civilization's deepest magic tricks. It turns memory into objects. It turns obligations into marks. It turns food into numbers. It turns human time into something that can be counted, assigned, and demanded. Before long, a worker may not only ask what he owes the temple, the tablet can answer for him. Small clay, large power. In Sumerian thought, this organized world is not only practical, it is sacred. A city has a divine owner. A temple is not merely a public building. It is the home of a god, the center of economy, ritual, storage, and identity. The city's order mirrors a cosmic order. What happens in storerooms and courtyards reflects what is believed to have been arranged in the unseen world. This is where the Anunnaki mystery quietly returns. In later Mesopotamian texts, the Anunnaki appear as a group of powerful deities connected with judgment, fate, and the structure of divine authority. Their exact role changes across texts and periods, which is one reason scholars handle them carefully. They are not a single simple category. Sometimes they seem associated with the underworld, sometimes with the great gods who determine destiny. Sometimes they stand as a council, weighty and remote. Yet in the larger Mesopotamian imagination, gods are often involved in administration. They assign, measure, decree, and receive. They do not float vaguely above the world. They govern it. A grounded reading says this reflects how human society understood power. Kings and temples projected their own order into divine language. If earthly cities needed officials, divine reality could be imagined with councils and decrees. If temples organized grain, the gods could be imagined as owners of the whole system. That reading makes sense, but the curious fringe tidbit lies in the reverse possibility some have wondered about. Perhaps the gods seem administrative because the earliest remembered order itself felt inherited from something structured before writing. Not necessarily in the literal sense of a vanished technological empire, Though some fringe interpretations lean that way, more softly, the myths may preserve a memory of earlier systems of authority, ritual knowledge, or specialized leadership that had already formed before Sumer's written voice became clear. The evidence does not settle this. It only lets the question breathe. You move through the city and notice how many things require prior knowledge. A canal must be cut at the correct angle. Mud brick must be dried in the sun, stacked, repaired, replaced. Grain must be planted according to the season. Herds must be counted. Offerings must be timed. Labour groups must be fed. Trade goods must be recognized. Copper, stone, timber, and lapis lazuli do not all come from the local plain. They arrive through networks reaching distant places. The city is local, but its needs are wide. This matters because Sumer does not stand alone as an isolated miracle. It belongs to a deep landscape of human experimentation. Before Sumer's famous city life, people across the Fertile Crescent had already domesticated plants and animals, built villages, made ritual structures, exchanged materials, and transformed landscapes. Jericho, Çatalhöyük, Göbekli Tepe, and other early sites remind us that complex human behavior long predates Sumerian writing. So why does Sumer feel like the first? Because Sumer speaks. Its clay record gives historians a kind of voice that earlier sites rarely provide. We can read rations, names, offerings, school exercises, hymns, legal disputes, and royal claims. We can hear a civilization talking to itself. That does not mean it was first in every deeper sense. It means it was among the first whose internal memory hardened into durable words. This distinction is gentle, but important. The first readable civilization is not necessarily the first complex world. The first city with a surviving voice may sit above generations of quieter foundations. Beneath each written sign are older gestures, older songs, older counting habits, older rituals, and older fears. A scholar may call this cultural development. A myth might call it divine descent. A late-night storyteller might say the clay began speaking only after a much older silence had already done its work. None of these phrases fully replaces the others. As the sun lowers, Uruk changes colour. The baked bricks soften from pale beige to amber. A line of workers moves past a wall, carrying baskets of earth. A scribe lifts a tablet and turns it toward the light. The marks are still wet enough to shine. They record something ordinary, perhaps barley, perhaps labour, perhaps an offering owed to a temple household. Yet the ordinary is the clue. A civilization does not need only monuments to be advanced. It needs repeated habits. It needs shared assumptions. It needs invisible agreements strong enough that people obey marks in clay. By the time those marks become common, the city has already crossed a threshold that must have taken centuries to approach. And so the phrase first civilization begins to loosen in your hand. Sumer is first in a powerful sense because it gives us writing, cities, and records with remarkable clarity. But even at its earliest visible edges, it carries the weight of older experiments. It appears not as an infant opening its eyes, but as a young adult who has forgotten much of childhood. The night wind moves along the canal. Water touches the mud bank with a low sound. In the dark, the city seems less sudden. Its walls rise from older villages, its records from older counting, its temples from older sacred places, and its gods from older patterns of authority. The city looks new to history, but history arrived late. At Eridu, the beginning does not feel like a shout. It feels like a low place near water, where reeds bend in the wind and the land seems to remember being half marsh, half dream. You walk toward the old mound as though approaching a thought that has been covered and uncovered many times. The air tastes faintly of salt, mud, and sun-baked clay. Eridu was one of the most ancient cities of southern Mesopotamia, and in Sumerian tradition it held a special kind of prestige. It was not always the largest, it was not always the most powerful, yet it carried the aura of an origin place, a sacred city associated with Enki, the god of wisdom, water, craft, and deep knowledge. In later memory, Eridu was the kind of place where civilization did not merely happen, it was received. The archaeology gives one kind of story, the myth gives another. Beneath the mound, excavators found a long sequence of temple levels, one built over another through centuries of rebuilding. A small early shrine became larger, then larger again, as if generations kept returning to the same sacred point and raising it higher with new brick, new offerings, new arrangements. The detail is modest, but quietly powerful. The sacred center did not appear as a finished monument. It grew through repetition. That matters. A city may vanish from power, but a sacred place can hold memory longer than politics. People return because their parents returned. Priests rebuild because older priests rebuilt. A platform rises because something below it still matters. Over time, the first reason may blur, but the action continues. You pause near the imagined temple of Enki, where fresh water is not simply water. In Mesopotamian thought, the deep waters beneath the earth, often called the Abzu, were connected with wisdom, fertility, and hidden order. Enki's domain was not the blazing sky, but the mysterious depth from which life-giving water emerged. This is a grounded mythic pattern, tied to the real importance of water in an irrigation world. Yet the symbolic meaning becomes stranger when placed beside the claim that Eridu was a beginning. In some Mesopotamian traditions, kingship first descended from heaven to Eridu. That line has fascinated historians, mythologists, and fringe readers alike. A cautious reading sees it as sacred political language. Kingship needs legitimacy, so it is described as descending from the divine realm. Eridu, already old and revered, becomes the perfect place to anchor authority. Still, the image lingers. Power descends. A city receives it. Human order begins under divine supervision. You do not need to force the phrase into a literal event. It works more quietly as a memory shape. Civilization, in this telling, is not invented from below. It is granted from above or brought from beyond ordinary human reach. The old scribes may have meant theology, not history. Yet theology often preserves what a culture believes about its own deepest past, and Eridu's belief seems to be that the beginning was not entirely human. Here the unusual tidbit rests like a small shell in mud. Some modern fringe interpreters have wondered whether Enki's connection with the Abzu represents not merely sacred water, but a memory of an older hidden source of knowledge. They sometimes imagine subterranean chambers, lost schools, or even beings who carried technical wisdom into the first cities. Such readings go far beyond what the evidence can prove. They should remain speculative, but they are drawn to Eridu for a reason. The city's myths already frame wisdom as something rising from a concealed depth. The mainstream view is steadier. Eridu likely began as an early settlement in a watery environment where temple authority, ritual practice, and community organization developed over a long time. The earliest shrines show continuity rather than sudden perfection. The city's fame grew because it was old, sacred, and associated with a god whose qualities matched the needs of civilized life. Water, wisdom, craft, order. The scholarly uncertainty lies in how much actual memory survives inside the myth. When a later text says kingship descended to Eridu, does it preserve a recollection of Eridu's early political importance? Does it reflect religious imagination created much later? Does it combine old memory with later temple ideology? The record does not answer neatly. It gives fragments, and scholars must work between them. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the texture of the story. You move through Eridu in the softened light of late afternoon. The mud brick edges are worn down by weather and time. No complete temple rises in front of you. Only the mind's reconstruction of buildings that once stood where people prayed, counted, offered, repaired, and waited. The city's shape must be partly imagined, but the ground is real. The layers are real. The rebuilding is real. And that is where the attention peak arrives. If Sumer was the first civilization, why did one of its oldest sacred cities already remember a beginning before ordinary history? The answer may be simple. Ancient peoples loved origins. They placed beginnings in revered places, because old cities needed old stories. But the answer may also be layered. Eridu's mythic importance might preserve a memory of real antiquity, of settlements and ritual systems whose earliest meanings had already faded by the time writing caught them. You sense how memory changes when it becomes too old. It stops behaving like a straight record. It becomes a place, a name, a god, a phrase repeated in a schoolroom, a line copied by a tired student pressing signs into clay, a story that no longer explains itself but still refuses to disappear. Eridu is that kind of memory. It sits near the edge of history with a calmness that makes the question deeper. It does not need giant walls to feel ancient. Its power is in repetition, in rebuilding, in the sense that people stood on the same sacred spot again and again, until the ground itself became a statement. Maybe this is how civilization begins more often than we think. Not with one invention, one ruler, or one sudden awakening, but with returning to water, returning to ritual, returning to a mound where ancestors once placed offerings, returning until the place becomes older than anyone can remember. The Sumerian texts turn that returning into sacred language. They say kingship descended. They say wisdom belonged to Enki. They say the world was arranged by powers whose decisions shaped human life. A historian hears ideology. A mythologist hears pattern. A dreamer hears a door closing softly behind something earlier. You stand beside that door without trying to open it too quickly. The reeds whisper around the old city. Evening insects begin their thin music. Somewhere in the imagined temple court, a priest pours water into a basin, and the surface trembles under the first star. The water reflects nothing clearly. That feels appropriate. Eridu gives no single answer. It gives a depth. Its temples rise from older temples. Its god rules from hidden waters. Its memory of kingship begins with descent from heaven. Its archaeology shows human continuity, while its myth suggests sacred inheritance. Together they create a city that feels less like a starting point and more like a marker placed above something deeper. The first civilization, seen from Eridu, does not look first in the simple sense. It looks like the first place where an older memory found clay, temple, name, and voice. A king list is supposed to make time behave. It places names in order. It gives reigns, cities, dynasties, transfers of power, and the comforting sense that history can be lined up like jars along a storeroom wall. Yet the Sumerian king list does something stranger. It begins by trying to organize the past, then quietly leads you into a place where ordinary time no longer feels obedient. You sit with the tablet in lamplight, watching the names emerge through translation. Kingship descends from heaven. It settles first in Eridu, then moves from city to city. Alulim reigns. Alalgar follows. Other names appear, and their reigns stretch beyond normal human measure. Tens of thousands of years pass beneath individual rulers, as if the earliest kings belonged to a world where time moved with a different weight. The numbers are impossible if read as ordinary biography. That is the first thing a careful reader admits. No mainstream historian treats these reign lengths as straightforward records of human rulers living for 28,000 years, 36,000 years, or more. The king list is not a modern chronology. It is a political and theological document, probably shaped by scribes who wanted to place rival cities into one grand sequence of legitimate kingship. It gives order to memory, but not always in the way a modern archive would. Still, the list remains one of the most fascinating texts from ancient Mesopotamia, because it does not simply invent a royal past. It arranges one. It joins mythic rulers, remembered dynasties, city traditions, and political ideas into a single stream. Some later kings in the list correspond more closely to known historical figures. Earlier ones drift into mythic time. The boundary between memory and sacred imagination is not marked with a sign. It fades. You follow that fading boundary as though walking along a riverbank at dusk. On one side lies recoverable history, where names can sometimes be checked against inscriptions, cities, and archaeological layers. On the other side lies the older zone, where rains become vast and the flood waits like a dark line across the tablet's thought. Then comes the quiet attention peak. The king list does not merely say that ancient kings ruled for impossible lengths of time. It divides the world into before and after the flood. This matters because a flood is more than a weather event in Mesopotamian memory. In texts across the region, flood traditions mark a rupture in human history. They separate an earlier age from a later one. They imply that something was lost so thoroughly that normal continuity had to begin again. In the king list, after the flood swept over, kingship descends again. The phrase is calm, almost administrative, but the idea is enormous. Power returns after destruction. To a grounded historian, this flood division may reflect old memories of catastrophic river flooding in Mesopotamia, later transformed into mythic world history. The Tigris and Euphrates were unpredictable. Floods could devastate settlements, reshape fields, ruin stores, and leave trauma deep enough to become story. Archaeological evidence for flood deposits exists at some sites, though not as one simple universal event covering all cities at once. This is where scholarly uncertainty enters softly. Were Mesopotamian flood myths shaped by local floods, regional disasters, older oral traditions, symbolic theology, or some combination of these? The answer remains debated. The flood story is not a clean newspaper report. It is a layered tradition, carried across languages and centuries. But the king list adds another strange pressure. It places impossibly long rains before the flood, then more human-scaled rains afterward. This pattern has invited many interpretations. Some scholars see symbolic numbers, perhaps based on numerical systems meaningful to scribal culture. Others see attempts to magnify the prestige of primordial kings. Some consider whether very long reigns may represent dynasties, not individuals. A few have wondered if the numbers encode astronomical or ritual cycles rather than literal lifespans. And then there is the fringe reading, which should be kept in the softer corner of the room. Some modern interpreters imagine the antediluvian kings as traces of a lost pre-flood order, a civilization remembered only through inflated numbers, divine associations, and broken royal memory. Some connect those rulers with the Anunnaki, suggesting that the earliest kings may have been understood as semi-divine agents, or representatives of powers that governed before ordinary human history. The evidence does not prove that it does not need to. The power of the text is that it already sounds like a memory of history before history became manageable. It gives names to a time that no tablet can fully control. It says, in effect, there was order before the catastrophe. There were cities before the rupture. Kingship existed before the world began counting again. You let that settle slowly. A city archive wants stability. A royal list wants legitimacy. A scribe wants sequence. Yet here the sequence begins in a realm of almost dreamlike duration. The old kings are not placed outside the list. They are included. That inclusion is important. The scribe does not simply say, "Once there were myths, and then history began." He places mythic kings and more historical rulers within one continuous structure. That is strange. It suggests that ancient memory did not separate myth and history the way modern readers often do. The earliest past could be sacred, exaggerated, symbolic, political, and still meaningful as the beginning of kingship. The story did not need to be factual in a modern sense to carry authority. It needed to explain why rule existed, where it came from, and how cities inherited it. The city names themselves are like lamps in fog. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. Some are archaeologically known. Some are harder to place with certainty. Each name feels like a peg hammered into the soft ground of primordial memory. Around those pegs, the list stretches numbers so large that you feel the past expanding beyond the size of the tablet. A small clay surface holds a cosmic timeline. The Sumerian numerical system helps explain some of the strangeness. Mesopotamian scribes used a sexagesimal system based on units of 60, which shaped mathematical, astronomical, and administrative thought. Large numbers could have symbolic resonance, and scribal culture was comfortable with structured numerical patterns. The long reigns may not be careless fantasy. They may be meaningful exaggerations built from an intellectual world where number, order, and sacred authority belong together. Still, meaning is not the same as certainty. You can imagine a scribe copying the list in a school setting, perhaps not understanding every ancient name he writes. He presses the wedge marks carefully because the old sequence matters. His teacher checks the line, the stylus moves, a name survives, a reign length survives, a city survives. But the lived world behind the name has already slipped beyond reach. This is how a civilization can preserve memory and lose it at the same time. The king list becomes a bridge made of clay. One end rests in more recognizable history, where rulers build, fight, boast, and leave inscriptions. The other end disappears into sacred antiquity, where kings rule for spans that feel less like human lifetimes and more like ages of the world. Between them lies the flood, not only water, but interruption. In the quiet, you realize that the list does not answer whether Sumer was truly first. It complicates the word first. If the Sumerians themselves imagined kingship as descending before the flood and descending again after it, then their earliest written tradition already places civilization inside a longer, broken rhythm. Order arrives, order is lost, order returns. Outside the tablet room, night gathers over the plain. The canals darken. The stars appear slowly above mud brick roofs. Somewhere, a royal name once spoken with reverence has become a few signs on clay, and beside it stands a number no human life could fill. You do not have to believe the number literally. You only have to notice that someone preserved it, and perhaps that is the deeper wonder of the king list. It does not give you a clean beginning. It gives you a memory of beginnings layered over one another, with history, myth, politics, and sacred time pressed into the same small surface. The tablet tries to make time behave. Instead, it shows you how old the question really is. The gods of Mesopotamia do not always behave like distant lights in a peaceful sky. They meet, decide, assign, withhold, punish, reward, measure, and distribute. They have households, messengers, servants, territories, rivalries, and responsibilities. They are surrounded by the language of order. That is why the Anunnaki feel so unusual when you meet them in the older imagination. They are not simple figures with one fixed role across every text. Mesopotamian religion changed over time. Across cities, languages, dynasties, and scribal schools, a god could have several functions, and a divine group could shift meaning depending on context. The Anunnaki appear in different ways, sometimes linked with the great gods, sometimes with judgment, sometimes with the underworld, sometimes as a council whose presence gives weight to divine decisions. They are hard to simplify, and that is part of their power. A modern reader often wants a clean definition. Ancient religion rarely offers one. It behaves more like a city of overlapping rooms, where names echo through different doors. The Anunnaki are not always described with the same precision, but they carry the feeling of authority. They belong to the heavy machinery of divine order, to decisions that shape the world of gods and humans alike. You sense this most clearly in the way Mesopotamian stories imagine power. The gods do not merely create and vanish, they supervise. They distribute destinies. They receive offerings through temples. They own cities in a sacred sense. They can be displeased by noise, neglect, rebellion, or improper service. Their world resembles an expanded version of human hierarchy, but larger, older, and more mysterious. This is where mainstream history gives a useful lamp. The people of Sumer and later Mesopotamia lived in societies where temples and palaces organized land, labor, food, and ritual. Authority had to be maintained across complex communities. It is not surprising that divine order was imagined in administrative terms. If earthly life depended on managers, scribes, overseers, and councils, then heavenly life could be pictured through similar patterns. The gods became the highest administration. There is a quiet irony in that. Modern people sometimes imagine ancient myth as wild fantasy, but many Mesopotamian myths are remarkably organized. Even the supernatural has paperwork in its bones. Decisions are made in assemblies, roles are assigned. Divine powers called me, those mysterious principles or decrees of civilization, are possessed, transferred, guarded, and sometimes stolen. The me are especially strange. They appear in Sumerian literature as divine powers or cultural offices that make ordered life possible. They include aspects of kingship, priesthood, truth, music, craft, sexual life, weapons, judgment, and other features of civilization. In one famous mythic pattern, these powers are not invented casually by humans. They belong to the divine realm and are connected with gods such as Enki and Inanna. That's the attention peak, quiet but bright. Civilization is imagined almost like a set of sacred operating instructions. This does not mean the Sumerians believed in machines in a modern sense. It means they understood civilization as structured, authorized, and dangerously powerful. Order was not a vague feeling. It had components. It had offices. It had rules. It had roles one could lose, gain, misuse, or transfer. When the myths speak of divine decrees, they are not only talking about religion, they are talking about the architecture of society. A careful scholar might explain the me as symbolic expressions of cultural institutions. They are mythic language for the things that make a city a city. Kingship, craft, music, ritual, law, and social identity are placed under divine ownership to show that they are not private human inventions. They are sacred gifts, and therefore they must be handled properly. That explanation is grounded and strong. Yet some have wondered whether this language preserves an older memory of knowledge systems passed down through specialized groups before writing. Perhaps temple culture did not invent every ritual and social form from nothing, but inherited deep patterns from earlier settlements, oral traditions, and priestly practices. Fringe readers sometimes go much further, imagining the me as remnants of advanced instruction given by non-human teachers. That reading cannot be demonstrated from the evidence. Still, the mythic shape invites speculation because it treats culture as something delivered, not simply discovered. You walk into a temple courtyard in the mind's eye. The brick is warm beneath the last light. A copper bowl catches a red reflection from the sky. Priests move quietly near an altar. Scribes keep account of offerings, grain, animals, oil, textiles, and labour. Nothing about the scene feels random. Each action belongs to a sequence. Each object has a place. This is civilization as choreography. At its centre stands the idea that humans serve within a larger order. They do not control the god. They negotiate, honour, fear, feed, praise, and depend on them. A city's survival is practical, but it is also sacred. If the god withdraws favour, if the canal fails, if the temple order breaks, human life becomes fragile very quickly. The Anunnaki fit naturally inside this worldview. They suggest a divine society above the human one, with rank and judgment. They remind you that Mesopotamian religion often imagined reality as layered administration. Earthly rulers were not alone. Above them were gods, assemblies, decrees, and fates. The uncertainty is how far this reflects lived political reality, and how far it preserves older cosmological memory. Did people imagine divine councils because human councils existed? Or did human institutions gain shape by imitating sacred patterns people already believed were ancient? The relationship moves both ways. Religion reflects society, but society also performs religion. The clay record lets you see both, but not separate them fully. A king may claim divine support because it strengthens his throne. A temple may preserve divine myths because those myths make the temple indispensable. A scribe may copy old stories because they belong to education, identity, and ritual. Yet beneath these practical functions, there remains a deeper question. Why did the earliest written culture picture civilization itself as something that must be authorized from beyond ordinary humanity? One cautious answer is that complex order feels too large for any single person to invent. Ancient people saw cities, seasons, rivers, birth, death, kingship, and craft as part of a web larger than themselves. Divine administration was a way of making sense of that web. A more mysterious answer whispers beside it. Maybe the first scribes inherited traditions from older communities that had already forgotten the original makers of certain knowledge. When origin becomes unclear, memory often lifts it into the sky. The gods become the keepers of old beginnings. This is not a claim of proof. It is a careful reading of mood, pattern, and mythic structure. The Anunnaki do not show that Sumer received civilization from a lost empire or from visitors beyond the stars. The tablets do not allow such certainty, but they do show that Sumerian imagination placed order before humanity, above humanity, and around humanity. That alone is enough to disturb the simple idea of firstness, because if the first readable civilization believed civilization came from an older divine order, then its own self-understanding was not modern pride, it was inheritance. The city did not say, "We made everything." It said, in many sacred ways, "We received our place." Night settles over the temple. The smell of incense curls through a doorway. A statue's eyes catch a faint gleam from a lamp. Somewhere, a clerk ties a label to a storage jar, and the small act belongs to the same world as hymns to heaven. The sacred and the practical do not separate. That is the strange calm of Mesopotamian civilization. A ration tablet, a temple hymn, a royal inscription, and a myth of divine decree all point toward the same hidden structure. The world must be managed. The city must be fed. The gods must be honoured. Memory must be kept. And somewhere above the human managers, the Anunnaki remain like a council heard through walls, never fully visible, but always associated with decisions already made. The first human beings in Mesopotamian myth do not always enter the world like honoured guests. Sometimes they enter like workers being assigned to a difficult estate. That thought is unsettling in a quiet way. You stand in a dim room where a tablet has been copied from an older story. Its signs speak of gods, labour, complaint, and the making of humankind. The clay is not giving you a modern scientific account of origins. It is giving you a sacred explanation for why humans must work, suffer, serve, build, carry, plant, dig, grind, and maintain the fragile order of life. In several Mesopotamian creation traditions, divine beings grow tired of labour. The work of maintaining canals, fields, and the earthly order becomes burdensome. Human beings are then made to take up that task. The details vary across texts, periods, and languages, but the pattern is striking. Humanity is created within a system of service. This is one of the oldest surviving answers to the question of why people exist. Not to rule the world freely, not to wander without obligation, not even, at first, to seek personal happiness. Humans exist to support divine order, to feed the gods through offerings, to maintain temples, to cultivate land, and to keep the cosmic household functioning. A modern listener may feel the harshness of that, yet the myth reflects a society where labour was everywhere. Irrigation demanded constant effort. Fields needed clearing. Canals silted up. Grain had to be harvested, stored and distributed. Temples required offerings as repairs, as staff and records. A city was not a dream of freedom. It was a coordinated burden. The myth turns that burden into origin. You notice how different this feels from later ideas of human dignity shaped by other traditions. In Mesopotamian thought, humans matter, but they are not usually the centre of creation in a sentimental way. They are necessary because the gods require service. Their lives belong inside a larger order that existed before them. There is the attention peak. In some stories, humans are not made because the world is empty. They are made because the divine system needs labour. This detail has attracted both scholars and fringe interpreters for a long time. A careful historian sees the myth as a reflection of temple society and agricultural reality. Ordinary people worked for institutions larger than themselves. The gods, imagined as divine masters, gave sacred meaning to that arrangement. The story explains why humans must endure toil. It also justifies temples as the proper channels between human work and divine need. That reading is grounded, yet the unusual tidbit rests in the specific tone of the myth. The gods are not only creators, they are problem solvers facing a workload. Human creation appears almost administrative, as if a new class of beings is introduced to carry out tasks. Some modern speculative writers have connected this with the Anunnaki, reading the myths as distant memories of engineered labourers serving powerful non-human overseers. That interpretation goes far beyond what the tablets can support, but it grows from a real textual pattern. The ancient stories do describe humanity in relation to divine labour management. The clay does not say what some modern theories want it to say, but it does say something strange enough on its own. You move into the human side of the story. A worker bends near a canal with mud on his legs. A woman grinds grain in a courtyard as dust clings to her hands. A potter turns wet clay while smoke drifts from a kiln. A young man carries baskets of earth for a building project ordered by temple or ruler. Each person lives within a web of obligation. The city survives because countless bodies repeat necessary tasks. In that world, creation as labour assignment does not feel abstract. It feels like explanation. Why do humans dig? Why do humans sweat? Why must grain be measured, rations received, and offerings delivered? Because the order of the world requires it. Because the gods arranged it so. Because life itself is service. There is a sadness in that, but also a kind of stability. The uncertainty begins when you ask how literally ancient people understood these stories. Did they imagine a specific event when humans were first formed for divine work? Did they treat the story as sacred metaphor? Did different communities hear it differently? Some scribes copied these texts in learned settings, perhaps with theological sophistication. Others may have known simpler oral versions. No single ancient listener can speak for all of them. The evidence remains incomplete. You can only watch the pattern repeat. Humans are placed in a world already structured by gods. They receive roles. They maintain what they did not create. They serve powers whose decisions came before them. Even when kings rise and cities grow, human authority remains secondary. The divine order is older. This helps explain why Sumer can feel like a civilization remembering an earlier arrangement. Its myths do not celebrate humans as the first inventors of society. They often describe humans as late arrivals into a system already heavy with rules, divine ranks, cosmic offices, sacred duties, and inherited powers. The human being arrives after the plan. That is a small sentence, but it changes the mood of the whole story. If civilization means organized labor, shared belief, social hierarchy, food production, ritual centers, and memory systems, then the creation myths place humanity inside those patterns from the beginning. The myths do not show a lonely person discovering civilization step by step. They show a populated divine world solving a problem by creating a working species. Of course, this is mythic language. Humans evolved over immense time, and cities emerged through long social development. Archaeology tells that story through bones, tools, seeds, houses, graves, and settlement layers. Myth tells a different kind of truth, not necessarily factual but revealing. It shows what a culture believed its labour meant, and Sumerian culture seems to have believed labour was sacred because it was demanded by the structure of reality. You hear this in temple offerings, and the gods are fed with bread, beer, meat, dates, and oil. Statues receive care as if divine presence lives through them. Human work becomes nourishment for the unseen. The temple kitchen, the field, the storeroom, the altar, and the tablet archive all belong to one cycle. A divine household must be maintained. The fringe imagination sometimes turns this into a darker image, picturing humans as a created workforce for masters who came from elsewhere. That picture is dramatic, but the ancient evidence is more subtle. It does not need spacecraft or secret machines to feel uncanny. The uncanniness is already there in the idea that the earliest written people saw themselves as servants of an order older than memory. You let the thoughts slow down. A reed mat lies on the floor. A jar of barley stands against the wall. A tablet records rations for workers whose names are mostly lost. Each name once belonged to a breathing person, someone with hunger, family, tired feet, and a place in the city's system. The myth says humans were made for work, but the tablet shows the workers were real. That is where the story becomes human again. Behind the divine decrees are people carrying baskets in heat. Behind the Anunnaki are clerks counting grain. Behind creation is the ache of shoulders, the rhythm of grinding stones, the smell of beer mash, the scrape of reed on clay, and perhaps that is why the myth endured. It made ordinary exhaustion part of a cosmic story. It told people their labour was not meaningless, even if it was heavy. It placed their small lives beneath the vast roof of divine order. The first civilization, then, was not only a place of invention. It was a place where work became memory. Memory became theology, and theology made the city feel older than its walls. Outside, the canal water darkens under evening. Someone rinses mud from a wooden tool. A child watches a scribe mark a tablet, not yet knowing that such marks may outlast kings. The human being was made to serve. The old stories whisper, but clay, unexpectedly, allowed the servant to remember. The temple does not sleep, even when the city grows quiet. Its courtyards empty slowly. Its lamps burn low. Its storerooms hold the smell of grain, oil, wool, dried fish, beer, and old clay. In the last hours before dawn, when the air is cooler and the bricks seem to release the heat of yesterday, the temple feels less like a building and more like a body with many hidden organs. This is one of the most grounded ways to understand early Sumerian civilization. The temple was not only a sacred place where people prayed, it was an economic center, a storehouse, a workplace, a ritual stage, and a memory system. In many early Mesopotamian cities, temple institutions managed resources, received offerings, distributed rations, organized labor, and gave religious meaning to practical life. The god's house was also a human machine. You walk through it slowly, a room for grain, a room for oil, a room where textiles are counted, a room where jars are sealed, a courtyard where animals are received, a shaded corner where a scribe presses signs into wet clay while another person waits, perhaps impatiently. Though polite impatience is probably as old as civilization itself, the temple turns movement into record. That is the quiet attention peak. Before civilization becomes a story of kings and wars, it is already a story of storage. Storage sounds humble, but it changes everything. Grain stored in one season can feed workers in another. Oil stored in jars can support rituals, meals, trade, and craft. Wool can become cloth. Cloth can become payment. Payment can become obligation. Once goods gather in one place, someone must guard them, count them, move them, and explain where they went. From that need, administration grows. The earliest written tablets from Mesopotamia are heavily administrative. They record commodities, numbers, labor, and institutional transactions. This is not a weakness in the evidence. It is a revelation. Writing began in the thick daily reality of managing a complicated world. A myth may speak of heavenly decrees, but a ration tablet shows the decree becoming bread. You touch the wall of an imagined storeroom. The mud brick is rough beneath your fingers. A reed basket leans nearby. The room is dim, but you can smell life inside it. Barley dust, clay ceilings, stale beer, and the faint sharpness of bitumen used to waterproof baskets or boats. Nothing here feels abstract. Temple economy is not one simple thing across every period and city. Scholars debate the exact scale and role of temple institutions in different phases of early Mesopotamia. Older views sometimes imagine temple control as nearly total, with the temple owning and directing most production. More recent studies tend to see a more mixed and changing landscape, where households, elites, temples, palaces, and local communities all mattered in different ways. The evidence remains uneven. Still, the temple's importance is undeniable. It gathered people, goods, rituals, and authority into one visible centre. It made the city's order feel both practical and sacred. It gave divine weight to the distribution of grain and the organisation of work. It taught people that everyday labour was part of a larger pattern. That larger pattern is where mystery returns softly. If you look at the temple as an ancient machine, not made of metal, but made of people, clay, faith, and food, then Sumer begins to look less like a sudden invention and more like the visible surface of a long experiment in coordination. The machine requires many components: ritual specialists, account keepers, skilled builders, farmers, canal workers, brewers, weavers, animal handlers, supervisors, messengers, seal cutters, potters, woodworkers. Each person becomes a moving piece in an order greater than any one household. Mainstream history explains this through social complexity. The settlements grew. Institutions emerged to organize resources and labor. Religious authority helped stabilize cooperation. Temples provided a shared focus for identity and obligation. The god's ownership of land and goods was a powerful social idea. That is clear enough. Yet the unusual tidbit is the way some myths describe divine powers almost as transferable cultural functions. To me, those sacred aspects of civilization suggest that social order was imagined as a set of powers held by gods, not merely invented by committees of tired administrators. Some modern fringe readers compare this to the handing down of a coded system. That is speculative, but the metaphor is revealing. Sumerian culture imagined civilization as something with parts, rules, offices, and authorized use. A temple is where those parts become visible. You watch a cylinder seal roll across wet clay. In one smooth motion, it leaves a tiny world behind. Figures, animals, divine symbols, perhaps a ritual scene. The seal proves identity, authority, and control. It is small enough to hang from a cord, yet powerful enough to secure goods and mark responsibility. It is one of those objects where art, bureaucracy, and sacred order meet without embarrassment. Modern people often separate beauty and paperwork. Sumer did not need to. A sealed jar could be both an administrative object and part of a sacred economy. A ration tablet could be both practical record and evidence of temple authority. A procession could be both public devotion and social coordination. The city's life moved through overlapping systems that later categories do not separate cleanly. Here, the open uncertainty becomes gentle but important. When archaeologists find storehouses, ceilings, tablets, and temple buildings, how much of the actual social life can be reconstructed? A room with jars does not tell every story of the people who filled them. A tablet with names does not tell whether the workers felt devotion, pressure, duty, fear, or simple hunger. A temple platform does not reveal every conversation held beneath its shadow. The material survives. The mood must be handled carefully. But even cautious reconstruction shows a world already deeply organized, and organized worlds often carry older habits within them. The temple economy may have grown from earlier communal storage, seasonal ritual, kinship obligation, and local leadership. By the time it appears in written form, those older roots are already shaped into something more formal, more visible, and more durable. The clay records the mature tree, not every root. You sit beside a low lamp and imagine a scribe at work. He is not writing a hymn tonight. He is writing numbers. The tablet records grain issued to workers, or sheep delivered, or oil measured for temple use. His marks are small and efficient. He may not think he is preserving the mystery of civilization. He is simply doing his job. Yet his job reveals the secret structure. Civilization is not only a wall, a king, or a myth. It is the ability to coordinate absence. The person who receives grain may not be present when the grain was harvested. The person who authorizes labor may not be present when the canal is cleaned. The god who owns the temple is present through statue, ritual, belief, and record. Clay holds the connection between people who are not standing together. That is a profound threshold. Once a society can trust marks, seals, and institutions, its memory extends beyond the human voice. The city can act across time. It can promise, demand, owe, and remember. It can become larger than face-to-face life. The temple is the heart of that expansion. It also helps explain why Sumerian tradition could imagine civilization as inherited from divine order. To a person living inside such a system, the city might genuinely feel too intricate to belong only to human decision. The temple machine was built by human hands, but its authority reached beyond them. The bricks were local. The meaning was cosmic. You step back into the courtyard as pale dawn touches the higher walls. A priest crosses the open space with a vessel of water. A worker lifts a sack of grain. A scribe wraps yesterday's tablet for storage. The day begins with ritual and accounting, as if the gods and the ledgers have agreed to wake together. The first civilization was not only written in myths, it was written in rations, seals of jars, a labor list, and rooms full of stored grain. And if the temple feels like a machine, it is because it performed the oldest work of civilization, turning fragile human effort into a pattern that could endure after the hands were gone. A buried city is rarely buried once. It sinks by layers, by repairs, by abandonment, by flood silt, by wind dust, by fallen walls, by the quiet recycling of old bricks into new buildings. People do not always leave a place cleanly. They rebuild on top of memory. They flatten what has collapsed. They raise floors above damp ground. They build new thresholds over old thresholds until the city becomes a mound of human repetition. In Mesopotamia, such a mound is often called a tell. From the outside, it may look like a soft hill in a flat landscape. From within, it can hold centuries or millennia of rooms, walls, hearths, graves, refuse pits, temple floors, storage spaces, broken pottery, and forgotten paths. The mound does not speak as clearly as a tablet, but it remembers in another way. It preserves the pressure of lives stacked upon lives. You walk across one of these ancient rises as morning light spreads over the plain. The ground under your feet is uneven. Pieces of pottery glint in the dust. A fragment of baked brick shows a line where human fingers once pressed wet clay into shape. The city below is not one city. It is many cities, occupying the same place, each one believing itself present, each one becoming foundation. This is where the idea of the first civilization becomes complicated again. Archaeology rarely finds an absolute beginning. It finds sequences. It finds earlier levels beneath later levels. It finds cultural phases, changes in pottery, shifts in architecture, new burial customs, new tools, new signs of trade, new ways of organizing food and labor. The first written city sits above long habits that writing did not invent. The ground keeps lowering the beginning. At sites across southern Mesopotamia, the visible Sumerian city often rests upon earlier settlement layers connected to the Ubaid and Uruk periods. These earlier phases show farming communities, temples, craft activity, exchange networks, and increasing social complexity. They are not Sumer in the later literate sense, but they are not empty prehistory either. They are the long preparation through which urban life became possible. That is the quiet attention peak. The more carefully you dig for the beginning, the more the beginning moves downward. This does not mean there was a hidden super-civilization beneath every city. That would be too simple, and the evidence does not support such certainty. It means that what people call the first civilization is often the first visible crest of a much deeper wave. The city with writing may be the one we hear, but the silence beneath it is not absence. It is older human effort without surviving words. You kneel beside an excavation trench in the mind's eye. The wall of earth shows bands of colour, ash, mud brick, silt, packed floor, broken pottery, another floor below that. Each layer was once a present moment. Someone swept that floor. Someone dropped that shard. Someone repaired that wall. Someone thought the building would last. Then another generation changed it. The mainstream historical detail here is simple but important. Early Mesopotamian urbanism developed through long processes of settlement growth, agricultural intensification, irrigation management, temple development, craft specialization, and regional interaction. The Sumerian cities did not rise from nowhere. They emerged from centuries of human adaptation to a demanding river landscape. But the unusual tidbit lies in the way later Sumerian traditions sometimes remember cities as if they were chosen or established within a divine order. Eridu is sacred. Uruk is mighty. Nippur holds authority. Shuruppak remembers the flood. Each city becomes more than an archaeological site. It becomes a node in a sacred geography, almost like points in an older map whose earliest meaning has partly faded. Some modern speculative readers have wondered whether this sacred geography preserves memory of a planned system, a network older than the written city names. That suggestion should remain careful and light. Archaeology offers stronger explanations through settlement patterns, water access, trade routes, temple prestige, and political development. Yet the mythic pattern is still interesting. The Sumerians did not imagine their cities as random human clusters. They imagined them as placed within an order. You continue along the mound as the sun warms the earth. A dry reed scratches against your ankle. The wind carries the faint smell of dust and distant water. Under your feet, older courtyards lie sealed in darkness. Their doors no longer open. Their ovens are cold. Their owners have no names in any tablet. This is one of the deep limits of history. Writing preserves some people and erases many more. Kings speak loudly. Temples speak often. Administrators leave thousands of marks. But the earliest farmers, builders, potters, mothers, children, and field workers beneath the written layers remain nearly silent. Their lives shaped the world that Sumer inherited, but they did not leave sentences for you to read. Their absence creates room for mystery. Scholars debate how much continuity links earlier cultures to later Sumerian identity. Did the people of the Ubaid period speak a language related to Sumerian? Were Sumerians newcomers to the region, local descendants of earlier groups, or part of a complex mixture? The question remains unsettled. The Sumerian language is a language isolate, not clearly related to known language families, which adds to the sense of strangeness around origins. That uncertainty should not be turned into wild certainty. A language isolate does not prove a lost empire or divine intervention. It simply means the surviving evidence has not connected Sumerian securely to a broader family. Languages can disappear without leaving relatives. Migrations can blur. Deep time can erase connections. Still, the effect is haunting. The first civilization whose writing we can read speaks in a language with no confirmed family. From cities built on older layers, in a land where myth says order descended from beyond ordinary humanity. Each fact has a grounded explanation. Together, they create a mood that is difficult to ignore. The ground, the language, and the myths all refuse a simple beginning. A city beneath a city also changes how you think about memory. People living in later Uruk or Eridu may not have known every layer beneath them. They may have seen old bricks, ancient foundations, strange objects turned up by digging, ruins older than their grandparents' stories. They may have felt, as people often do near ruins, that the land had a past longer than speech. Out of that feeling, myth grows easily. A broken statue found under a floor becomes an omen. A sealed room becomes a story. An old mound becomes a place where gods once stood. An earlier foundation becomes proof that the city has always been chosen. In this way, Archaeology and mythology may share an origin in wonder. Both begin when someone asks, "Who was here before us?" The difference is that archaeology answers with soil, and myth answers with meaning. You pass a trench where a mud brick wall descends into shadow. It is not dramatic. It is only a line of ancient clay squared by human hands. But its plainness is what makes it powerful. Someone made this wall for a need that mattered then. A storage room, a shrine, a home, a boundary, a place to sleep, measure, pray, or keep animals from wandering into grain. The first civilization was made of such ordinary acts. Yet when ordinary acts accumulate across centuries, they become something that later people can no longer explain simply. The city appears ancient even to itself. Its foundations turn into authority. Its repeated rituals become sacred tradition. Its oldest names become divine memory. What began as survival becomes cosmology. By sunset, the mound looks almost soft, as if time itself has rounded the corners. The sky lowers into amber, the plain darkens, pottery fragments lose their shine. Somewhere under your feet, one city sleeps inside another, and another beneath that, each one less recoverable than the last. The first city is not the lowest layer you can see. It is the lowest layer you can still understand, and below understanding lies the deeper mystery. Not necessarily a vanished golden age, but generations of human life whose traces remain without voices. They built, repaired, offered, traded, feared floods, watched stars, buried their dead, and handed down habits that later Sumer would press into clay. The city above them became famous. The layers below made fame possible. Writing begins with a kind of impatience. A memory becomes too heavy for the mind alone. A storehouse grows too full. A field produces too much grain to track by voice. A temple receives too many offerings. A worker's ration must be remembered after the worker has gone home. Someone owes something. Someone has delivered something. Someone must prove it. So the hand reaches for clay. The earliest writing of southern Mesopotamia does not arrive as a book of wisdom. It appears first as marks of management, pressed into damp tablets with a reed stylus. Before poetry, there are numbers. Before royal legends, there are goods. Before human beings write long stories about gods, they write about grain, sheep, beer, oil, cloth, labour, and containers. That is almost funny. In a gentle way, the oldest door into literature is a receipt. Yet this practical beginning is one of the most important details in the history of civilization. Cuneiform did not appear suddenly as a complete writing system for spoken language. It developed through earlier systems of counting, tokens, seal impressions, pictographic signs, and administrative marks. Over time, signs became more abstract. Their uses expanded. They began to capture names, sounds, grammar, and ideas with growing flexibility. Writing learned to speak slowly. You sit beside a scribe in a shaded room. The tablet in his hand is soft enough to accept pressure, firm enough to keep shape. He holds a reed stylus cut to a clean angle. The marks he presses are small wedges, neat and deliberate. The sound is almost nothing, a faint touch in wet clay, but the effect is enormous. A human thought has found a way to outlive the breath. This is the quiet attention peak. The first writing was not created to remember myths, but it eventually preserved myths older than writing itself. That shift is strange and beautiful. A system born from accounting became capable of carrying hymns, laments, prayers, school exercises, legal cases, royal boasts, medical recipes, omen texts, and stories of creation. Clay first counted the city's goods. Then it began to hold the city's soul. Mainstream archaeology explains the rise of writing through administrative complexity. In late Uruk society, institutions needed more reliable ways to track goods and labour. Tokens and seals had already helped manage information. Writing developed from these practical tools. This was not magic. It was invention through pressure, repetition, and need, but the sense of speed still catches the mind. When writing becomes visible, it feels as if a curtain has been pulled back. The earlier centuries are not empty, but they are quieter. And suddenly, names, numbers, offices, signs, and transactions appear. The city seems to start talking all at once. For this reason, writing can make civilization feel sudden, even when it was the product of a long development. The record changes the viewer's perception. Before writing, people lived, loved, feared, organized, prayed, traded, and remembered. After writing, some of that life becomes readable. The difference is not that humans became complex overnight. The difference is that complexity gained a durable voice. The unusual fringe tidbit appears in the gap between the long silence and the first written signs. Some speculative writers have wondered whether the rapid spread and usefulness of writing imply outside instruction, a recovered older knowledge, or a system introduced by elite temple specialists who guarded earlier traditions. The stronger evidence points to gradual local development from accounting practices. Still, the mythic imagination notices that Sumerian stories often treat knowledge as something bestowed, guarded, or transferred by divine powers. The practical and the mythic overlap again. A historian sees tokens becoming tablets. A myth speaks of divine decrees and sacred powers. A fringe reader hears echoes of lost teachers. A careful listener allows the possibilities to remain separate, without forcing them into one answer. You look at the earliest signs and notice how visual they are. A head, a bowl, a measure, a jar, a number. They are not yet the fully developed cuneiform of later scribal schools. They are closer to pictures and accounting symbols, arranged for institutional use. They do not read easily to modern eyes, and many early tablets remain difficult to interpret. This uncertainty matters. Scholars can identify many signs and patterns, but not every tablet yields a simple translation. Some early signs are still debated. Some numerical systems vary by commodity. Some tablets may record transactions whose context is lost. Writing at its birth is not transparent. It is a tool being shaped while being used. That makes the first tablets feel both familiar and alien. Familiar, because they track human concerns still recognizable today. Food, work, property, obligation, alien, because the system is incomplete to us. Built for people who already knew the context. A mark that meant something obvious in a storeroom 5,000 years ago can become a puzzle in a modern museum. The clay remembers, but not always politely. As writing matures, scribes become essential. They are more than copyists. They are trained keepers of signs, numbers, formulas, and institutional memory. Learning to write takes discipline. A student must copy lists, signs, words, phrases, and model texts. The schoolroom becomes one of civilization's most powerful hidden spaces because it produces the people who can make memory official. A spoken claim may fade, a written tablet can accuse. This is a deep transformation. Writing creates distance between event and witness. It allows authority to travel beyond the person speaking. It makes a temple larger, a palace stronger, a legal claim sharper, and an old myth more durable. It also changes time. A dead scribe can still be read. A forgotten king can still boast. A worker's ration can survive longer than the worker's name in anyone's family. In that way, writing is almost a second kind of afterlife. Yet even this afterlife has limits. Clay tablets break, libraries burn, floors collapse, cities flood. Later scribes copy older texts and sometimes alter them. A myth may survive because someone copied it centuries after its first telling. A tradition may look ancient because it is ancient, or because later scholars carefully shaped it to appear so. The debate never fully sleeps. When you ask whether Sumer was truly first, writing answers and deceives at the same time. It answers by giving us the first extensive readable civilization. It deceives by making the written world feel more original than the unwritten world beneath it. Writing is not the beginning of complexity. It is the beginning of recoverable voices. That difference is everything. You imagine an older storyteller before writing, sitting in a reed house by dim firelight. He speaks of gods, floods, first cities, deep waters, and powers brought from beyond ordinary sight. His words vanish into children's memories. Generations later, a scribe presses a version of such stories into clay. The moment feels like an origin to us, because the clay survived. But the story may already be old. This is why early writing creates such a delicate mystery. It is new as a technology, but it carries older human material. The first written myths may be like water poured into a newly made jar. The jar is new. The water is not. Outside the scribal room, the city stirs in the heat. Donkeys complain near a gate. A jar seal cracks under someone's thumb. A boy watches his teacher shape a sign and tries to copy the angle correctly. His tablet is clumsy, full of mistakes, but even mistakes become evidence when buried long enough. The city is learning to remember itself, and because it remembers itself in clay, it becomes first in a way earlier worlds could not. Not first to build, not first to worship, not first to count, not first to wonder. First, perhaps, to leave enough signs that later ages could hear its thoughts moving through administration into myth. The stylus lifts. The wet marks remain. Somewhere inside them is the beginning of history as readable memory, and somewhere behind them is the older silence that writing never fully captured. Flood stories sound simple until you sit with them too long. Water rises. The world breaks. A chosen survivor carries life across the ruin. The waters fall back, and human history begins again on damp ground. It is one of the oldest patterns in storytelling, and in Mesopotamia it carries a particular weight, because the rivers were never only scenery, they were life, danger, blessing, and threat in the same moving body. You stand near a canal at night and listen to the water move against the bank. It sounds calm now, almost kind, but southern Mesopotamia depended on rivers that could shift, flood, feed fields, drown fields, and change the fate of cities. Irrigation made civilization possible. Yet water always reminded people that order was temporary. This is why the flood in Mesopotamian tradition feels more than symbolic. In Sumerian and later Akkadian stories, a great flood interrupts the human world. Different versions preserve different names and details. The Sumerian flood story includes the pious figures Yasudra. Later Akkadian traditions give us Atrahasis and Utnapishtim, known from broader Mesopotamian literature. These texts do not match perfectly, but they share a powerful shape. The gods decide destruction. A warning reaches one human. A vessel preserves life. And the world that follows is not quite the same as the world before. The flood becomes a hinge. That is the quiet attention peak. In some Mesopotamian traditions, history does not begin once, it begins again. This matters deeply for the question of whether the first civilization was truly first. If the old texts divide time into a world before the flood and a world after the flood, then the written imagination of Mesopotamia already carries a broken timeline. The people preserving these stories did not imagine history as a clean upward path from emptiness to cities. They imagined loss, reset, survival, and renewed order. A careful historical reading begins with real rivers. Floods in Mesopotamia could be devastating, and archaeological layers at some sites show flood deposits from different periods. These deposits do not prove one universal flood covering all cities at the same time. They do show that severe flooding was part of the lived landscape. A community destroyed or transformed by water might carry that trauma for generations. Over time, local disaster can become world memory. That's a grounded explanation, and it is strong. Human beings often turn catastrophe into myth because myth gives disaster shape. A flood that wiped out fields, homes, and shrines would feel like the end of the world to those who survived it. If the story passed down through centuries, it could grow into a cosmic event, especially in a culture where gods controlled fate, weather, and human destiny. Yet the flood traditions also invite a more curious reading. They suggest that something important belonged to the world before the waters, cities, kingship, divine decrees, long-lived rulers, sacred knowledge. The flood does not interrupt a wilderness. It interrupts order. That is the strange part. In the king list, kingship exists before the flood, disappears under the catastrophe, then descends again afterward. The result is not creation from nothing, but restoration after loss. Some fringe interpreters have wondered whether this pre-flood world represents a remembered civilization erased by a real ancient catastrophe. Others connect the flood with global myths from many cultures, suggesting a shared memory of prehistoric disaster. Such ideas should be handled carefully. Similar flood stories can arise in many river and coastal societies, because floods are common and psychologically powerful. But the Mesopotamian texts do preserve a distinctive feeling that human order was already old before the Great Rupture. The clay does not prove a lost golden age. It does preserve the imagination of one. You move through Uruk in thought. The city often associated with flood traditions. It lies in the Mesopotamian landscape as both archaeological place and memory site. In stories, it becomes a city where warning is given, where one man hears what others do not, where the fragile thread of life passes through destruction. The real city had its own long history, its own layers, its own people whose daily lives were not mythic to them. They were simply alive. A woman may have measured grain in a courtyard, a child may have slept beside a reed wall, a farmer may have worried about water levels, not because he was inside a legend, but because too much water could ruin everything. Later, stories would carry the name of the city into a larger sacred drama. That is how memory transforms. The scholarly uncertainty lies in how these flood traditions developed. Did they begin with a specific historical flood remembered through oral transmission? Did several flood memories merge? Did scribes use flood imagery to explain why the known world felt separated from a mythic past? Did theological concerns shape the story more than environmental experience? The evidence leaves room for more than one answer. The uncertainty is part of the river. You see how flood memory changes the meaning of civilization. A city's greatest enemy may not be ignorance. It may be interruption. Knowledge can be lost. Archives can dissolve. Brick can melt back into mud. A written tablet can survive fire. But unfired clay can vanish in water. A temple can be rebuilt, but the reason for its oldest ritual may fade. After a flood, people do not simply rebuild walls. They rebuild meaning. That rebuilding may explain why Mesopotamian tradition places such emphasis on descent and restoration. Kingship descends from heaven. Then, after the flood, it descends again. The repeated descent is like a sacred reset, a way of saying that authority survived catastrophe because it came from a source beyond human fragility. From a mainstream perspective, this legitimizes later political order. If kingship returned after the flood, then current kings belong to a divinely supported chain. The story stabilizes society by placing its institutions beyond ordinary human accident. The city may be vulnerable, but kingship itself is not merely human. From a more mysterious perspective, the repeated descent feels like a memory of reinstallation. The world's operating order is lost, then given again. That does not need to be literal to be haunting. It suggests that ancient people sensed a break between an earlier age and their own. You sit with that break while the water moves in darkness. A flood story contains fear, but it also contains preservation. The survivor is never only saved for himself. He carries seed, animals, instructions, memory, or divine favor. He becomes the narrow bridge between worlds. Without him, the past would be sealed under silt. With him, the future begins in grief. This is why flood myths feel so restful and unsettling at once. They are stories of destruction, but also of continuity. They say that something ended. They also say that something crossed over. In Mesopotamian tradition, what crosses over may include civilization itself, not every detail, not every city, not every name, but the idea of order, the pattern of offerings, kingship, labour, divine decree, and human dependence on powers beyond control. The post-flood world is not wholly new. It is a second attempt beneath the same heavens. The first civilization, seen through flood memory, becomes a survivor's civilization. It may be first to us because its clay endured, yet in its own stories, it stands after rupture, after vanished kings, after earlier cities, after a waterline drawn across memory. The tablets do not allow us to reconstruct that earlier world with confidence, but they show that the Sumerians and their successors imagined one. The canal wind cools your face. A reed boat moves like a dark shape along the bank. Somewhere beyond the city, low fields hold the moon in shallow water. You can almost feel why a people of rivers would never fully trust the ground. Civilization rises on mud. That is its danger and its miracle. The flood stories do not tell you that Sumer was second in any simple historical sense. They tell you that ancient memory itself was broken, and that the first readable world believed something had been lost before reading began. Water took the earlier lines. Clay kept the later ones. The old teachers do not enter the story loudly. They come half hidden, shaped by fragments, names, symbols, and later memories that never settle into one simple form. In Mesopotamian tradition, there are figures who stand close to the boundary between gods and humans, between culture and mystery, between ordinary instruction and sacred transmission. They are often called sages. In later Akkadian tradition, they are known as the Apkallu. You meet them in a strange light, not as kings, not quite as gods, not ordinary men either. They appear as wise beings associated with the time before the flood, culture bringers who advise ancient rulers, preserve knowledge, and connect human civilization to divine wisdom. Some are described in traditions connected with the god Ea, the Akkadian counterpart of Sumerian Enki, lord of deep waters, craft, and hidden understanding. The connection is important. Wisdom again rises from the deep. The mainstream view treats the Apkallu as mythological sages, part of Mesopotamian scholarly and religious tradition. They help explain how culture, ritual knowledge, and royal order were transmitted from divine sources to human society. In later texts, they could be linked to protective magic, temple wisdom, and the authority of learned specialists. Their images appear in art as protective figures, sometimes with human bodies and bird-like features, sometimes associated with fish-cloaked forms connected to watery wisdom. They are not easy to reduce, and that difficulty makes them quietly powerful. You stand inside a ritual chamber where the air smells of wax smoke, cedar, and old plaster. On the wall, a protective figure may be imagined with wings spread, one hand raised, another holding a small bucket or cone. Objects whose exact ritual meaning still invites debate. Nearby, a priest recites words meant to guard a threshold. A scribe knows the formula. A craftsman has shaped the image. A king may believe such protections help hold the world in place. The figure is both art and authority. That is the attention peak. Mesopotamian tradition did not only imagine gods giving civilization, it imagined intermediary sages carrying knowledge across a broken age. This is where the story becomes especially delicate. The Apkallu are not presented as simple historical professors from an early school. They belong to mythic and ritual imagination. Yet their role reveals something important about how Mesopotamian people thought knowledge survived. Wisdom was not casual, it was guarded, transmitted, authorized, and linked to beings who stood closer to the divine world than ordinary humans. A careful scholar might say the sages reflect the prestige of scribes, priests, diviners, exorcists, and temple scholars. Learned professionals in Mesopotamia preserved complex traditions, copied old texts, read omens, performed rituals, and advised kings. By placing the origin of such knowledge in ancient sages, later scholars gave their own work a sacred ancestry. That explanation is convincing. Still, the older atmosphere remains. The curious fringe tidbit comes from the way some modern readers connect the Apkallu to the idea of lost teachers from before the flood. They wonder whether these figures preserve distant memories of culture-bearing specialists from a forgotten period, people whose knowledge seemed almost supernatural to later generations. Others go further and imagine non-human instructors guiding early civilization. Such readings exceed the evidence, and they should remain speculation. But the mythic pattern itself is real. Knowledge descends through extraordinary beings from an earlier age. You walk through that pattern slowly. The first civilizations do not only need farmers and builders, they need people who remember how things must be done, how to purify a temple, how to read a liver omen, how to calculate a measure, how to name a star, how to recite a hymn correctly, how to protect a doorway, how to write a royal inscription, how to bury the dead in a proper way, how to restore order after illness, eclipse, flood, or fear. Such knowledge becomes powerful because it is not obvious. Anyone may see the river. Not everyone knows the ritual words for the river's danger. Anyone may see the moon. Not everyone knows how to read its changes as signs. Anyone may hear a story. Not everyone knows the old virgin, the correct sequence, the sacred name. Civilization depends on specialists. The sages are the mythic form of specialization. An open scholarly uncertainty rests in the relationship between the pre-flood sages and later learned culture. Were these traditions designed mainly to glorify scribal professions? Did they preserve older myths that were later adapted for court and temple use? Did different cities and periods imagine the sages differently? The surviving texts and images do not give one final answer. They show a tradition that grew and shifted, like a river changing course while still carrying old water. You notice how often water returns when wisdom is discussed. Enki, Ea, the Abzu, Eridu, fish-like imagery, the deep beneath the world. This may reflect the life-giving importance of groundwater, canals, marshes, and the Gulf environment in southern Mesopotamia. Water was not just a resource. It was a symbol of hidden fertility and unseen depth. To say wisdom came from the deep was to give knowledge a sacred geography. A more mysterious reading hears something else in that depth. It hears the idea that knowledge has an origin beneath the visible surface of history, not necessarily underground chambers or secret races, though such images attract modern imagination. More quietly, the deep may represent everything older than the written record: oral tradition, ancestral technique, ritual memory, craft knowledge, and vanished teachers whose names are gone. The deep is where forgotten origins go. You sit beside a school tablet, rough and uneven, where a student has copied signs badly. His teacher may have corrected him sharply. The boy's hand has slipped. The wedges are crooked. Yet this ordinary exercise belongs to a chain of transmission reaching back through generations. A clumsy tablet and a mythic sage are not as separate as they first appear. Both are about preserving knowledge from loss. The child learns signs. The culture survives, in some traditions. The sages before the flood are followed by later sages after the flood. But the post-flood figures may be more human, less primeval, less directly connected with the divine beginning. That shift is telling. The oldest knowledge appears closest to the gods. Later knowledge becomes inherited, copied, interpreted, and sometimes weakened by distance. The pattern resembles the way many cultures imagine decline from a golden age, but Mesopotamia gives it a particular scholarly flavour. Knowledge becomes older than kings. This idea complicates the meaning of first civilization. A civilization may be first in records, yet still present itself as taught. It may build temples, write tablets, and rule cities, while claiming that the deepest arts were handed down by sages from an age before the flood. Such a culture does not imagine itself as standing alone at the start. It imagines itself as the receiver of instructions. You can feel why that would matter. A king rules more securely if his rituals belong to ancient sages. A priest speaks more powerfully if his words descend from divine wisdom. A scribe copies with more reverence if his signs are part of a chain older than the city. Tradition turns knowledge into inheritance, and inheritance makes the present feel anchored in depths no one can fully measure. The lamp burns lower. The protective figure on the wall seems almost to move in the uneven light. Its wings are not flying, they are guarding. Its face is calm, its purpose is quiet. The room holds the scent of resin and clay, and the silence feels carefully maintained. You do not need to decide whether the sages were memory metaphor, priestly self-portrait, or echoes of older teachers. They may be several things at once. What matters is that Mesopotamian tradition placed wisdom behind the visible start of civilization. The arts of living, ruling, counting, cleansing, building, and interpreting were not imagined as ordinary accidents. They belonged to a chain of sacred transmission, fragile enough to require protection, and old enough to reach into the mist before the flood. The first civilization, in this light, is not a child inventing language in an empty room. It is a student copying from a tablet whose original has already been lost. A seal is small enough to fit in the hand, yet it can hold an entire world. You lift it gently in thought. A cylinder of stone carved with figures so tiny they seem to belong to the edge of sight. When rolled across wet clay, it leaves a scene behind. Gods seated on thrones, worshippers approaching, animals standing in ordered rows, stars and crescents above, heroes gripping beasts, boats, temples, trees, flowing lines, and symbols that still do not surrender all their meanings. The image appears in motion. That is the wonder of the cylinder seal. It is not simply stamped, it rolls. The picture unfolds like a quiet procession, a miniature story revealed by touch. In ancient Mesopotamia, seals marked ownership, authority, identity, and control. They closed jars, secured doors, confirmed transactions, and connected a person or institution to an object. A seal was both signature and symbol. You stand in a storeroom where a cord has been tied around a jar neck. A lump of wet clay has been pressed over the knot. Someone rolls a seal across it, leaving divine figures and personal authority in a single line of image. The jar may contain oil, grain, beer, or something reserved for temple use. Once sealed, it cannot be opened without leaving evidence. Trust has become visible. That is a mainstream historical detail with quiet force. Cylinder seals were essential to administration, trade, and institutional life in Mesopotamia. They helped manage goods in societies where written records were growing, but where image, identity, and authority still worked together. A carved stone object could speak for a person when the person was absent. Absence needed proof. Yet seals were never only practical. They carried scenes filled with religious and social meaning. Some images repeat across periods with variations that scholars study carefully. A seated deity receiving a worshipper, a banquet, a ritual approach, a heroic struggle, a sacred tree or plant, animals in balanced pairs, a star symbol above a divine figure. These images seem familiar after many examples, but their exact meanings are not always obvious. The seal whispers more than it explains. That is the quiet attention peak. Some of the most repeated images from early civilization may be messages no one can fully read. This is not because scholars have failed carelessly. It is because images function differently from writing. A cuneiform sign can sometimes be translated into a word. A seal scene may carry ritual, status, mythic, political, protective, or personal meaning all at once. The image may have been perfectly clear to its ancient owner, while remaining partly closed to you. A god raises a hand, a figure pours liquid, a creature stands behind a throne, a star appears above a scene. You can describe these elements, compare them, date them, and place them in artistic traditions. But the full sentence of the image may be lost. The unusual fringe tidbit lives in that loss. Some modern speculative readers look at seals and see coded memories of ancient teachers, celestial events, hidden technologies, or Anunnaki councils. A few famous seals have been interpreted outside mainstream scholarship as showing planetary systems or divine beings in technical roles. Those interpretations are debated and often rejected by specialists, who usually understand the scenes through Mesopotamian iconography, religion, and artistic convention. The careful path does not require dramatic certainty. It is already mysterious that a small seal could preserve visual formulas older than many surviving texts. It is already strange that certain motifs move through centuries, changing shape while keeping a recognizable power. It is already enough to notice that civilization remembered itself not only in words, but in repeated images. You roll the seal again in your mind, the scene appears, disappears, then appears again. That repetition matters. Every seal impression is a kind of controlled memory. The carved stone is the source. The clay is the temporary receiver. The image can be multiplied, attached to goods, stored in archives, broken, buried, and found thousands of years later. The original hand is gone. The old world remains. Scholars debate how much narrative content some seals preserve. Does a scene refer to a known myth? Does it show a ritual act? Is it mainly a marker of status? Does it combine protective symbolism with administrative identity? The answer depends on period, region, object, and comparison. Some images align with broader mythological themes, others remain stubbornly ambiguous. This uncertainty is useful. It reminds you that civilization is never fully recoverable through texts alone. Many meanings lived in gestures, songs, colours, materials, smells, and images whose context have vanished. A seal impression found on a clay ceiling may tell you that a jar was controlled. It may not tell you what the owner felt when he chose that design. Perhaps pride, perhaps devotion, or perhaps fear. The Anunnaki, too, belong partly to this problem of representation. Divine councils, seated gods, ranks of supernatural figures, and symbols of authority appear in Mesopotamian art. But connecting every image directly to a named divine group is difficult. Ancient visual culture does not always provide labels. A figure may be divine because of horned headgear. Another may be royal. Another may be a worshipper. The scene may show hierarchy without naming everyone. Power is visible, but not always identified. You enter a workshop where a seal cutter bends over stone with patient concentration. The stone may be imported, perhaps from distant trade routes. It is hard, small, and valuable. The cutter works with tools, abrasives, eyesight, and skill. He must carve in reverse so the impression appears correctly. Every line requires foresight. A mistake cannot be brushed away like dust. This craftsmanship reveals another layer of early civilization. Trade networks bring materials, specialists transform them, institutions use them, images carry meaning, clay receives impressions, archives preserve them. The tiny object sits at the meeting point of economy, art, technology, identity, and sacred thought. A seal is a civilization in miniature. That may sound poetic, but it is also practical. It shows how many systems must already be functioning for such an object to matter. Without trade, the stone may not arrive. Without specialists, it cannot be carved. Without administration, it has no bureaucratic force. Without shared symbols, its images lack authority. Without clay, its impression cannot travel. The seal proves that Sumerian civilization was already highly networked by the time its images and records become abundant. And once again, the question of firstness loosens. A culture capable of such symbolic compression must have deep roots in older visual habits. Before writing, people used marks, tokens, ornaments, figurines, and ritual objects. They marked bodies, containers, walls, graves, and tools. The seal belongs to that long human history of making meaning visible. Writing did not replace symbols, it joined them. As dusk enters the workshop, the seal cutter stops and blows fine dust from the stone. The nearly finished cylinder catches a little light. Its figures are too small to dominate a temple wall. but they will travel farther than most monuments. They will pass through hands, storerooms, gates, and archives. They will mark goods. They will identify someone. They will guard a transaction with an image of order. In the late quiet, you sense why seals attract mystery. They are intimate objects that preserve public power. They show scenes without explaining them. They combine gods, humans, animals, stars, and symbols on a surface no longer than a finger. They feel like fragments of a language older than translation. The first civilization did not only write itself, it sealed itself, and in those sealed images, you glimpse a world where authority could be rolled into clay, where sacred signs protected jars of grain, where memory travelled through repeated scenes, and where some meanings remain beautifully, stubbornly silent. Nippur does not need to be the largest city to feel central. Some places rule by armies, some rule by trade, some rule by age, ritual, and the strange authority of being treated as the place where the universe listens. Nippur belongs to that quieter category. It stands in the old Mesopotamian imagination as a sacred centre, strongly associated with Enlil, one of the most powerful gods in the Sumerian pantheon. You approach it not as a capital of empire, but as a city of permission. That word matters. Permission. In Mesopotamian kingship, power was not merely taken, it had to be recognized, justified, and placed within divine order. A king might conquer, build, tax, command, and boast, but his rule needed sacred weight. Without divine favour, kingship felt unstable. With divine favour, a ruler could present himself as part of a larger plan. Nippur helped give that plan a voice. The Temple of Enlil, often known as the Ekir, held enormous religious prestige. Kings from different cities and later dynasties sought legitimacy through honouring Nippur and its god. Even rulers whose political power lay elsewhere could gain symbolic strength by restoring, endowing, or associating themselves with this sacred centre. In this way, Nippur's authority reached beyond ordinary city politics. It was a place where kingship became cosmic. You walk through an imagined approach to the sanctuary. The sun is pale and high. Dust clings to sandals. Workers carry baskets of brick fragments. Priests move with controlled steps. Scribes hold tablets close. Because records and offerings must not be confused. Somewhere inside the sacred precinct, Enlil's presence is not treated as an idea. It is treated as a fact around which society arranges itself. The atmosphere is solemn but not empty. A temple city like Nippur was alive with tasks. Offerings needed preparation. Buildings needed repair. Ritual calendars needed attention. Archives needed organization. Students learned old texts. Officials watched resources. Pilgrims, envoys, labourers, and specialists moved through spaces where sacred authority and human administration met again. The quiet attention peak arrives there. A city without permanent political dominance could still decide who sounded legitimate. That is one of the remarkable features of Nippur. Its sacred status allowed it to shape political imagination even when power shifted among rival cities. This reveals something important about early civilization. Authority was not only military or economic, it was also symbolic. A ruler needed a story that made his rule feel older than himself. For a mainstream historian, this is part of the religious structure of Mesopotamian kingship. Cities had patron gods. Rulers claimed divine support. Temples served as centres of ideology and social order. Nippur's prestige made it useful for kings who wanted to frame their rule as authorised by Enlil, the great god associated with command, air, storm, and destiny. That explanation is grounded. Yet the curious fringe tidbit lies in the phrase often found in Mesopotamian royal thought. Destinies are decreed. Divine assemblies determine fates. Enlil and other high gods are not merely worshipped. They are imagined as powers who assign the shape of reality. Some speculative readers see in this a memory of an ancient command structure, with Nippur as a kind of sacred administrative centre where cosmic law was received, preserved, or mirrored, That reading cannot be proven in a literal sense. Still, the imagery itself is fascinating. The world is not imagined as loose. It is decreed. Kingship is not merely human ambition. It is granted. Cities do not stand only on mud brick. They stand on authorization. The idea feels bureaucratic, sacred, and mysterious at the same time. You pause near a tablet school in the city's shadow. Nippur has yielded many literary and educational tablets, including copies of older compositions that help modern scholars understand Sumerian literature. A student copies a proverb badly. Another works through a lexical list, those long word lists that trained memory and organized language. A teacher corrects mistakes with the patience or impatience of someone who has corrected the same sign for many years. The schoolroom is humble, but its role is immense. Through copying, Nippur preserves more than local devotion. It preserves fragments of a civilization's mind. Myths, hymns, proverbs, instructions, and lexical traditions survive because scribes repeated them. Repetition is not glamorous, but without it, the ancient world would be far darker to us. Here, another uncertainty opens. When later scribes copied older Sumerian texts, how much did they preserve faithfully? And how much did they reshape? Did a hymn reflect the beliefs of its first composition, the concerns of its later copyist, or both at once? Did school tradition freeze old language because it was sacred, prestigious, or useful for training? Scholars often work through layers of copying, dialect, scribal convention, and historical distance. A tablet can be ancient and still be a later copy of something older. That makes Nippur feel like a hall of echoes. You hear Sumerian voices, but not always from their first mouths. You read old stories through school tablets that may belong to later contexts. The words survive, but their journey is long. Every copy is a bridge. Every bridge changes the view. You move deeper into the city's sacred imagination. Enlil's authority is not gentle in every myth. He can command, judge, and overwhelm. His city therefore carries weight. It is not only a warm place of devotion, it is a place where order may feel severe, where destiny is not negotiated casually, where kings bow because their power needs approval from something older than conquest. This severity suits the broader Mesopotamian worldview. Rivers can bless and destroy, kings can protect and exploit, gods can nourish and punish. Civilization is precious because it is unstable. Divine order must be maintained because chaos is never far away. Nippur gives order a center, and if civilization was never truly first, then Nippur shows how later societies make themselves feel continuous with what came before. A sacred city can gather old names, older rituals, copied myths, royal claims, temple repairs, and student exercises into one living tradition. It becomes a memory engine, not a machine of bronze and gears, but a human system that keeps the past usable. That may be one reason sacred centers endure. They do not need to preserve every fact. They preserve orientation. They tell people where authority comes from, which gods matter, how kings should speak, why rituals should continue, and why the present is connected to a beginning no one can fully remember. In this sense, Nippur is not simply a location, it's a way of organizing time. The open scholarly question remains how old some of these traditions truly are. Did Nippur's centrality grow from early religious prestige, later political needs, or the accumulation of scribal tradition? The answer may involve all three. Ancient cities were not static symbols. Their meanings changed as rulers changed. Languages shifted, and old texts were copied in new circumstances. Yet the city's authority lasted. At sunset, Nippur's mud brick walls turn the colour of cooling embers. A priest carries an offering. A young scribe rubs a mistake from a practice tablet. A ruler's envoy waits with gifts meant to honour a god whose approval may make ambition appear sacred. Somewhere, a hymn names Enlil in tones of awe, and the words are old enough to feel less composed than received. You stand in that layered quiet and understand something important. A civilization does not only need a beginning, it needs a center that can keep saying the beginning still matters. Nippur became one such center. It held divine authority, scribal memory, royal legitimacy, and sacred fear in one place. It made the visible world answerable to an invisible order. It taught kings that power was not complete until heaven had given it shape. And beneath that lesson lies the deeper mystery. If the first civilization needed sacred permission to rule, build, count, and remember, then perhaps it never saw itself as the first owner of civilization at all. It saw itself as a steward of something already decreed, something descending through gods, cities, scribes, and clay. The wind moves through the ruins. The decree remains unreadable in full. A myth can be damaged without being false. It can lose names, dates, places, and practical details, yet keep the emotional shape of something remembered. It can turn a flood into a cosmic judgment, a ruler into a semi-divine figure, a migration into a divine command, or an old social change into a story of gods arguing in the dark. This is why myths must be approached gently. You do not hold them like court documents. You hold them like cracked vessels that may still carry the scent of what they once contained. Mesopotamian myths are not simple fantasy, but they are not straightforward history either. They belong to a middle space where memory, theology, politics, ritual, and imagination mix until no modern hand can separate them cleanly. That middle space is where the question of Sumer becomes most haunting. The mainstream historical world gives you tools, settlements, bones, seeds, canals, pottery, architecture, trade goods, tablets, and administrative systems. These are solid traces. They tell you that civilization emerged through long human processes shaped by environment, labor, social organization, and institution building. No serious reading needs to abandon that. But myth gives you something the soil cannot always preserve. It gives you how a people imagined their own depth. In Sumerian and later Mesopotamian stories, the world is often already old by the time humans take their recognizable place. Gods have ranks, cities have destinies, wisdom has keepers, kingship descends, divine decrees organize culture, floodwaters divide ages, sages carry knowledge across ruptures. These themes do not prove a hidden historical record, but they show that ancient people did not always imagine their society as a fresh invention. They imagined inheritance. That is the quiet attention peak. A myth may not preserve exact events, but it can preserve the feeling that something came before. You walk through a dim archive where tablets have been stacked, copied, broken, moved, and rediscovered. One tablet tells of creation, another of a flood, another of kings before ordinary time, another lists offerings to a god. The texts do not form one neat book. They are more like scattered bones from several animals, and scholars must be careful not to build the wrong creature from them. Still, patterns appear. A grounded scholar might explain these patterns as ideological. Myths made temple systems sacred. They justified kingship. They explained why labor existed. They gave cities honorable beginnings. They linked local cults with cosmic authority. This is not cynical. It is how societies give meaning to structures that might otherwise feel arbitrary or harsh. A temple is easier to obey when it belongs to a god. A king is harder to dismiss when heaven has chosen him. Yet this explanation does not empty myth of older memory. It simply places memory inside use. A story can serve power and still carry fragments from earlier oral traditions. It can be reshaped by scribes and still contain ancient motifs. It can become political without becoming meaningless. The damaged memory may still glow underneath. The unusual tidbit belongs to how some fringe interpreters read Mesopotamian myth as a corrupted record of a previous age, perhaps a vanished culture that survived only as divine story. They point to pre-flood kings, culture-bringing sages, descending kingship, and gods who managed labor as clues that Sumer remembered predecessors. This interpretation stretches beyond accepted evidence when stated too strongly. Yet its appeal comes from a real feature of the texts. The earliest written imagination keeps pointing behind itself. The problem is not whether myth contains history. The problem is how. Scholars remain divided on many details of mythic transmission. How old were the oral traditions behind written Sumerian compositions? How much did scribal schools preserve from deep antiquity? How much was invented, standardized, or reworked for later temple and royal contexts? When a myth is first written down, is it young because the tablet is young, or old because the story has been told for generations? The record rarely gives a final answer. You move from tablets to landscape. The wind carries dust across low mounds. Somewhere under the earth are earlier floors without writing. There are beads, hearths, seeds, animal bones, clay figurines, chipped tools, and traces of hands that did not press cuneiform signs. Those people had stories too. They explained rivers, birth, death, storms, stars, ancestors, and strangers. Their words are gone, but later myths may have inherited some of their shapes. This is how oral memory behaves. It does not preserve everything. It preserves what can be retold. A name may vanish while a pattern remains. A real disaster may become divine punishment. An old leader may become a king from before the flood. A skilled craft group may become sages taught by a god. A remembered migration may become a divine gift of destiny. Memory simplifies by transforming. That transformation is not failure, it is survival. You can think of myth as a river carrying broken objects. By the time they reach you, they are smoothed and altered. You may not know the house they came from, yet the wood is real, the clay is real, the motion that carried them is real. The challenge is to avoid pretending you can rebuild the whole house from one fragment. This is where responsible mystery lives. It doesn't say, "This proves everything," it says, "This keeps returning, and we should notice." Myth as damaged memory helps explain why the first civilization feels older than its official date. Sumer's written culture appears within a world already full of mythic references to earlier order. Those references may not be literal records, but they create a cultural memory in which the visible city is never alone. It stands among gods, ancestors, pre-flood kings, and sacred powers that precede human certainty. In practical terms, this may reflect the accumulation of earlier Near Eastern traditions. Farming began long before Sumerian writing. Ritual sites existed long before Sumerian temples. Villages developed social memory long before scribal archives. When Sumer wrote, it did not write into emptiness. It wrote at the end of a long unwritten conversation. That is a crucial thought. Civilization can be first in the library while being late in the story. The clay tablets are the library. The story is older. You pause beside a broken myth tablet whose missing section interrupts a sentence. A god may have spoken there. A city may have been named. A reason may have been given. The missing space is not blank in the emotional sense. It is full of everything that did not survive. The fragment teaches humility. It reminds you that ancient mystery is not always hidden by enemies, priests or secret keepers. Often it is hidden by time, water, salt, heat, collapse, reuse, and ordinary loss. A tablet breaks because a room falls. A story changes because a teacher prefers one version. A name disappears because no one copies it. The past does not vanish dramatically. It wears away. And still, some things remain. A flood, a descent, a city of beginnings, a divine council, a sage from before catastrophe, a human made for labour, a temple that acts like a cosmic household, a king whose authority comes from beyond himself. These are mythic forms, but they may preserve the felt memory of structures older than writing. Not exact history, a pressure mark, like a reed stylus pressed into wet clay, then blurred by a thumb. The original sign may be hard to read, but the indentation remains. Night gathers around the archive. The tablets cool. The lamp flame leans and steadies. You understand that myth does not give you a map to a lost civilization. It gives you the shadows of older human attempts to explain why civilization already felt inherited. And sometimes a shadow is enough to show that something once stood between the light and the wall. Long before Sumerian scribes pressed wedges into clay, human hands were already shaping the world in ways that refused to feel simple. You step away from the tablets for a while and follow the older trail through soil, stone, seed, bone, and buried architecture. Here the past does not speak in sentences, it speaks in hearths, grinding stones, animal pens, carved pillars, painted walls, obsidian blades, clay figurines, plastered skulls, and seeds darkened by fire. It speaks through things that survived without explaining themselves. This older world matters because Sumer was not born into emptiness. Across the wider Near East, communities had been farming, herding, building, trading, and gathering for ritual purposes thousands of years before the great cities of southern Mesopotamia became readable. People learned to manage wheat, barley, sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. They settled into villages. They stored food. They buried their dead with care. They made objects whose meanings remain partly hidden. These were not cities in the Sumerian sense, but they were not nothing. That is the quiet attention peak. The first civilization with writing stood on top of a world already full of memory. You walk through an older settlement and thought, far from the later temple archives. The houses are built close together. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Grain is ground by hand. Children move between walls their grandparents may have helped repair. A woman chooses seed for the next season. A man shapes a blade from stone brought from far away. Someone places an object near a burial, not casually, but with care. No one writes the reason down, yet the reason mattered. Mainstream archaeology shows that the Neolithic transformation changed human life long before the earlier Sumerian texts. Farming and settled life did not spread in one simple wave, and not every community changed at the same pace. Some groups remained mobile, others settled seasonally. Some built ritual spaces before full urban life emerged. The process was slow, varied, and deeply human. This makes the word first unstable again. If civilization means writing, cities, bureaucratic administration, and state-level complexity, then Sumer has a powerful claim in the ancient Near East. If civilization means the long accumulation of skills, beliefs, storage, ritual, cooperation, craft, and landscape management, then the roots reach much farther down. A tree is not first seen when the fruit appears. The fruit only makes the roots harder to ignore. You sense this especially in early monumental and ritual sites beyond southern Mesopotamia. Places such as Göbekli Tepe, much older than Sumerian cities, show that humans could organize impressive communal construction and symbolic life before farming societies had fully settled into later urban patterns. The site does not prove a lost global civilization, despite the excitement it sometimes inspires. It does prove something more subtle and perhaps more important. Deep prehistory was more complex than older assumptions allowed. People gathered for meaning before they gathered for bureaucracy. That detail matters for Sumer. It suggests that the sacred side of civilization may have very old roots. Temples did not emerge from minds that had never built ritual places. Divine households did not appear among people with no sense of sacred space. Priests and scribes may have formalized practices whose earlier shapes had already lived for generations in songs, offerings, seasonal gatherings, and ancestral memory. The fringe imagination often rushes toward the older world with lanterns raised too high. It sees carved pillars, strange symbols, astronomical alignments, and buried ritual sites. Then wonders whether a forgotten advanced culture passed knowledge down to later peoples. Such theories can be alluring, especially when a site feels too sophisticated for a simple picture of prehistory. Yet caution is needed. Sophistication does not require lost technology. It requires human patience, cooperation, symbolism, and time. Ancient people were not waiting to become intelligent. They were already human. Still, the older world contains enough mystery without exaggeration. Archaeologists debate the meanings of many prehistoric ritual objects. Were figurines symbols of fertility, ancestors, protection, teaching, play, status, or something else? Did monumental sites serve seasonal gatherings, ancestor cults, initiation rituals, feasting, territorial claims, or cosmological mapping? The evidence can support possibilities, right? But rarely one final answer. The silence is real. You walk beside a stone enclosure in early morning. The air is cold, the ground is pale, carved shapes stand in the dim light, and the world feels awake in a way that does not need a city wall. There are no cuneiform tablets here, no written king list, no named Anunnaki council. Yet there is coordination, there is symbolism, there is labour directed towards something beyond immediate survival. That should soften the old story of progress. Human history did not move from empty instinct to sudden civilization. It moved through countless experiments, many of them now invisible. A group learned to plant in one place, another learned to store better, another shaped ritual architecture, another traded shell, stone, or pigment across long distances. Another marked the dead with memory. Another gathered at seasonal times to renew bonds. By the time Sumer wrote, humanity had already been rehearsing complexity for millennia. This does not diminish Sumer, it makes Sumer more interesting. The Sumerian achievement was not that it invented human depth. Its achievement was that it gave a certain kind of depth a durable voice. It turned older patterns of settlement, storage, ritual, hierarchy, and meaning into a literate urban world whose records could cross time. You begin to understand why its myths look backward. The scribes may not have known the full deep history beneath them. They could not date the earliest farmers or map every prehistoric movement. But their culture may have inherited the emotional residue of older transformations. When stories speak of divine gifts, descending powers, culture bringing sages, and beginnings before beginnings, they may be giving sacred shape to a truth archaeology now confirms in another language. Civilization has roots far older than the first readable city. The old texts say the order came from before. The soil says the preparation came from before. The two voices do not prove the same thing, but they rhyme. You kneel beside a charred seed from an ancient hearth. It is tiny, almost absurdly small compared with temples, kings, and flood myths. Yet that seed may represent one of the great thresholds in human life, the decision to cultivate, return, store, plan, and depend on seasons. Without such decisions repeated across ages, no Sumerian storeroom would fill with grain, no ration tablet would need to be written, no temple economy could breathe. The smallest remains can carry the largest consequences. An open uncertainty follows you here. How directly can earlier prehistoric developments be connected to later Sumerian civilization? Archaeologists can trace broad processes, but not a simple, unbroken chain of intentions. People moved, environments changed, languages shifted, communities rose and vanished, traditions were borrowed, transformed, and forgotten. The path from early farming villages to Sumerian cities was not a straight road paved in advance. It was a landscape of branching paths. Some led nowhere visible. Some ended under silt. Some merged. Some became habits so basic that later people forgot anyone had invented them. This is what makes the older world feel so quiet and so important. It does not demand a single hidden master plan. It asks you to recognize that Sumer's firstness depends on where you begin counting. Begin with writing, and Sumer rises like dawn. Begin with ritual, farming, storage, craft, and symbolic memory. And the dawn becomes only one brighter moment in a much longer morning. The sun lifts over the plain. The older settlement fades from view. replaced by fields, villages, mounds, and eventually cities. You feel time folding, not in a dramatic way, but gently, like cloth stored in a chest. One layer touches another. The unwritten touches the written. The prehistoric touches the mythic. The practical touches the sacred. And somewhere in that layered contact, the first civilization becomes less lonely. It stands with ancestors it could not name, borrowing their seeds, their rituals, their fears, their storage habits, their sense that places could be holy, and perhaps their oldest stories about a world arranged before memory. The Sumerian tablets speak, but beneath them the ground has been whispering longer. The word first is a fragile little lamp. It shines brightly when the room is dark, but once more lamps are lit, its edges become less certain. First city, first writing, first king, first temple, first civilization. These phrases feel clean because they help the mind organize deep time. Yet deep time does not like clean edges. You stand in the quiet between museum glass and ancient soil, holding the word carefully. Sumer is often called the first civilization because it gives us a powerful combination of cities, writing, administration, monumental temples, specialized labor, law-like practices, long-distance exchange, and surviving texts. That combination is extraordinary. It changed what historians could know. Through Sumerian and later Mesopotamian records, ancient people begin speaking in ways that can still be studied, translated, debated, and felt. But first does not always mean earliest in every human sense. It may mean first visible enough, first readable enough, first preserved enough, first organized in a way archaeology and text can identify clearly, first to leave a dense record in clay rather than only traces in earth, stone, and bone. That is the quiet attention peak. Sometimes first civilization means the first one whose memory did not completely die. This is not a small distinction. It changes the way you listen to history. If you say Sumer was the first civilization, you may imagine a sudden flame appearing in darkness. If you say Sumer was the first civilization whose written voice survived in great depth, the image changes. Now the flame rises from embers already glowing beneath ash. The mainstream historical detail is steady. Sumer's role in the development of urban life and writing is central to world history. Its cities such as Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and Nippur show remarkable complexity. Its scribal culture preserved administrative records, literature, myths, hymns, school texts, and royal inscriptions. The importance of Sumer is not reduced by recognizing older roots. It becomes more precise. Precision is calmer than exaggeration. You move through a museum gallery where tablets rest under controlled light. Their labels give dates, places, periods, and descriptions. A small administrative tablet may sit near a cylinder seal. A royal inscription may stand near a fragment of myth. Visitors pass by quickly, sometimes too quickly, because clay does not always announce its importance. It is brown, small, and quiet. Yet inside that clay, an entire civilization learned how to remain. Earlier peoples also remembered, but they remembered through voices, bodies, monuments, rituals, and objects less easily translated. Their songs vanished, their stories shifted, their languages left no clear tablets. Their meanings survive only as patterns in material remains. Sumer's difference is not that it alone possessed depth. Its difference is that part of its depth became legible. The museum gives it a second life. The unusual fringe tidbit sits beside this thought like a shadow by the display case. Some modern interpreters argue that if Sumer appears so developed when it becomes readable, it must have inherited knowledge from a vanished civilization. The claim often goes too far when it insists on advanced lost empires without strong evidence. Yet the softer version is not unreasonable. Sumer certainly inherited from earlier cultures, older traditions, and long human experiments in settlement, ritual, farming, and coordination. The debate is about scale, not inheritance itself. No civilization begins alone. The open uncertainty lies in how much we can reconstruct from what survived. Archaeologists see settlement layers, tools, building plans, pottery styles, botanical remains, trade goods, and burial patterns. Historians read texts from later moments. Linguists study a language without a confirmed family. Mythologists compare divine stories and flood traditions. Each field brings a lantern, but none lights the whole chamber. The deeper past remains unevenly illuminated. You can feel that unevenness in the word civilization. It is useful, but it is also heavy with modern assumptions. It often privileges cities, writing, hierarchy, monumentality, and state organization. Those features matter, but they can cause quieter forms of complexity to look primitive by comparison. A village without writing may still have rich ritual life, ecological knowledge, seasonal planning, kinship systems, trade relationships, and stories as layered as any later myth. The absence of archives is not the absence of intelligence. That sentence should be allowed to rest. The Sumerians themselves lived in a world of categories different from ours. They did not call themselves the first civilization in a modern textbook sense. They understood cities through gods, temples, kingship, land, language, and inherited sacred order. Their myths did not present the city as a purely human achievement rising out of emptiness. They gave civilization a divine background, a pre-human structure, a chain of authority that began beyond the visible. So the modern label, first, and the ancient self-image do not perfectly match. Modern scholarship sees Sumer near the beginning of written urban history. Ancient tradition often sees Sumerian order as received from older divine powers. Between these views lies the central mystery, not a contradiction to be solved too quickly, but a tension to be held. You walk out of the museum and back into imagined Mesopotamian evening. The light changes from white gallery lamps to red dusk over mud brick walls. A tablet is no longer an exhibit, it is fresh clay in a scribe's hand. A canal is not a diagram, it is water that must be controlled before it destroys the field. A temple is not a ruin, it is a working house of a god, full of food, smoke, fear, and obligation. The people inside this world do not know they are early, they know they are responsible. That may be one of the most human truths in the whole story. No one lives at the beginning of history. People live in the middle of their own problems. They repair roofs, settle disputes, measure grain, teach children, honor gods, fear sickness, watch the sky, and remember what their elders told them. Only later do others place them at the start of a timeline. First is often a title given by descendants. Surviving is often the real achievement. You consider how many possible firsts have vanished. A first story never written, a first ritual site later dismantled, a first village swallowed by river change, a first leader remembered for 3 generations, then forgotten, a first song sung over seed grain before anyone pressed a sign into clay. These firsts do not compete with Sumer's greatness. They surround it with silence. This silence is not empty. It is crowded with lost beginnings. Sumer's tablets give you the rare privilege of hearing one ancient world speak with unusual clarity. But even that clarity is partial. The tablets are broken. The contexts are incomplete. The translations are careful, but sometimes uncertain. The surviving texts are not a full census of thought. They are what time, excavation, and chance allowed through. History is not only what happened, it is what escaped destruction. That is why first may sometimes mean first survivor, the first civilization whose archives endured, the first whose administrative habits hardened into readable clay, the first whose myths could be compared line by line, the first whose kings could boast across millennia, the first whose school children's mistakes could still embarrass them gently before modern scholars. There is something tender in that. A student's tablet, a ration list, a broken hymn, a seal impression, a flood story, a king list. All of them survive not because they were meant for you, but because clay is stubborn. Human intention and accident work together. Fire destroyed buildings but baked tablets harder. collapse buried archives. Dryness preserved what water might have erased. The past reached you through accident as much as design. As night settles, the word first grows softer. It no longer needs to be thrown away. It simply needs to be understood with humility. Sumer can remain first in a meaningful historical sense, while not being first in every deeper human sense. It can be dawn and inheritance at the same time. A dawn is not the birth of the sun. It is the moment light reaches the watcher. The clay tablets are such a dawn. They reveal a civilization already carrying older memories, older practices, older sacred ideas, and older fears. They do not close the question of what came before. They open it carefully, like a door that has swollen with age and moves only a little. You stand before that narrow opening. Beyond it lies not certainty, but depth. A scribe does not always know the age of the story he copies. He may know it is old because his teacher says so. He may know it belongs to a respected tradition because it appears on school tablets, in temple archives, or in compositions that train generations of students. He may know the signs, the formula, the proper order of lines and the sacred names. Yet the first voice behind the story may already be lost to him. You sit beside him in a room smelling of wet clay, reed fibre and lamp smoke. His tablet rests on a low surface. The clay is smooth, prepared, and still cool enough to receive the stylus. He leans close, eyes narrowing slightly, because the model tablet is worn in places. A sign is unclear. A corner has broken. A phrase has survived with the stubbornness of an old root, but the soil around it has washed away. He must decide how to copy what he cannot fully see. This is not only a scribal problem, it is the problem of ancient memory itself. Sumerian scribes were highly trained specialists. They learned signs, vocabulary lists, numerical systems, administrative formulas, literary compositions, hymns, myths, proverbs, and royal language. Scribal education was difficult, repetitive, and disciplined. Students copied lists again and again, not because repetition was charming, but because civilization depended on correct memory. A mistaken sign could change meaning. A missing number could change obligation. A poorly copied tradition could change the past. The quiet attention peak arrives in that small act of copying. The first civilization may have preserved older stories without fully understanding where they began. This is not an insult to ancient scribes. It is almost the opposite. It recognizes how long tradition can live beyond explanation. People today repeat phrases whose origins they do not know. They preserve rituals whose first meanings have softened. They inherit names, songs, gestures, and beliefs that no longer carry their original setting. The ancient world did the same, but with clay as its patient witness. A mainstream historical reading sees scribes as guardians of institutional and literary continuity. They served temples, palaces, households, schools, and administrative systems. Their work allowed cities to manage resources, preserve legal decisions, train officials, transmit religious texts, and give kings a durable voice. Without scribes, Sumerian civilization would be far less visible to us. They made memory durable, but durable memory is not perfect memory. You watch the scribe copy a line about kingship, divine order, or a city whose name is ancient even in his own day. Perhaps he knows the grammar well. Perhaps he understands the story as theology. Perhaps he thinks of it as something venerable but distant. He may not wonder whether it preserves a distorted recollection of older settlements, earlier rituals, or forgotten political systems. He is not a modern archaeologist. He is part of the tradition he transmits. That makes his work both intimate and mysterious. The unusual fringe tidbit rests in the idea that scribes may have been copying the last surviving traces of a knowledge chain far older than their own cities. Some speculative readers imagine hidden priesthoods guarding pre-flood wisdom, or temple schools preserving instructions from mysterious teachers. Such claims often outrun the evidence. Yet the softer possibility is reasonable. Oral traditions and ritual patterns likely existed long before they were written, and scribes may have preserved material whose origins were already obscure. The clay gives you a late doorway into an older room. An open scholarly uncertainty follows every literary tablet. How old is the composition itself? Was the surviving copy made centuries after the first version? Did earlier oral forms exist? Did scribes revise, standardize, expand, or combine traditions? Was a myth shaped by one city's theology, then adapted elsewhere? These questions do not have one answer, because every text has its own history. A tablet can be both old and late, old in the tradition it carries, late in the physical form you find. This double nature gives Mesopotamian literature its dreamy depth. You're not hearing one time, you're hearing many times layered together. An old myth copied in a later school, a Sumerian hymn preserved by scribes who lived when Akkadian was dominant, a royal tradition reshaped to serve a different political age, a sacred name kept long after its first local meaning faded. The scribe becomes a bridge he may not fully see. You look at his hands. They are not grand hands. They are working hands, trained by repetition. The stylus leaves signs in rows. Some signs are elegant. Others are rushed. His wrist aches. His teacher coughs. Someone outside carries water. A fly lands on the edge of a drying tablet, then lifts away. The room is ordinary, and yet this ordinary room controls how much of the ancient mind will survive. No monument is more important than a copied line. That may sound strange, but it is true in the quiet way history is often true. A ziggurat can crumble into a mound, but a school tablet can preserve a mythic phrase. A palace wall can fall, but a list of divine names can carry theological memory across centuries. A king can lose a battle, but a scribe can keep his boast alive for thousands of years. The power of the scribe is not dramatic, it is cumulative. The scribe's warning, if he has one, is hidden inside his labour. He reminds you that every surviving ancient text is mediated. It passed through hands, schools, expectations, conventions, errors, repairs, choices, and accidents. The tablet is not a window without glass. It is glass with scratches, reflections, and missing corners. Still, you can see through it. You see a civilization that understood itself through inheritance. You see gods who decide before humans act. You see cities chosen before their citizens can explain why. You see kingship descending rather than merely rising. You see labour as part of a cosmic arrangement. You see flood as rupture. You see sages as transmitters. You see writing as memory, but also as evidence that memory had become too heavy to trust to voices alone. The scribe may not say this aloud, but his work says it. A later researcher in a museum may hold his tablet and feel the same uncertainty from the other side. The modern scholar knows more about archaeology, chronology, language comparison, and historical method. But the scholar also depends on the scribe. Without that ancient hand, there is no line to translate, no myth to debate, no king list to puzzle over, no quiet contradiction to follow. Across thousands of years, two readers meet over clay. One copies from the past, one reconstructs from the copy. Between them lies damage. This is where the emotional shape of the story becomes clear. The first civilization was never truly first, because even its memory was inherited, copied, corrected, misunderstood, and renewed. The scribe stands near the beginning of written history, but he is also standing inside a chain of older voices. He does not create all meaning. He receives, preserves, and reshapes it. That is why his warning is quiet. Do not mistake survival for origin. The tablet that reaches you may not be the first version. The written myth may not be the first telling. The city named in a sacred line may not be the first sacred place. The divine decree may not be the first form of authority. The archive is not the birth of memory. It is memory after it has learned to fear forgetting. Outside the room, evening settles over the city. The last light rests on mud brick walls. The scribe sets one tablet aside to dry. Its lines are neat, but one sign near the edge is slightly damaged. Perhaps it will be understood. Perhaps it will trouble someone far in the future. Perhaps a missing corner will become a question no one can close. The scribe leaves the room. The clay remains. And in that remaining, you hear the softest warning of all: the past is not only what was written, but what writing tried, and failed to save completely. The gods remember in a way humans cannot. That is how Mesopotamian stories often feel when you listen beneath their surface. Human lives pass quickly. Cities rise, crack, flood, burn, and rebuild. Kings carve their names into brick, hoping the future will not be rude enough to forget them. Scribes copy old lines because memory in human hands is fragile. But the gods stand outside ordinary forgetting. In the stories, they know what happened before human beings were made. They remember the arrangement of the world before kingship settled in cities. They know the decrees, the hidden waters, the divine assemblies, the reasons for labour, the anger before the flood, and the decisions that reshaped life afterward. Their memory is not like human memory. It is older, heavier, and less easily questioned. You sit in the cool shadow of a temple wall, where a statue's eyes seem to look past the room. The statue does not move. Its silence is part of its force. Around it, people bring food, water, oil, incense, cloth, and prayer. They behave as if the divine presence holds knowledge that no human archive can equal. This is a mainstream feature of Mesopotamian religion. Gods were not distant symbols only. They were treated as powerful beings whose favour sustained city life. Divine statues were ritually cared for. Temples functioned as households of the gods. Rituals maintained relationships between human communities and the unseen powers believed to govern destiny. Fertility, kingship, and cosmic order. The human city depended on divine continuity. That is the quiet attention peak, where human records break slate. Divine stories claim to remember earlier. This does not mean the myths are factual reports from before history. A careful reading cannot take them that way. Yet the structure matters. When a culture places knowledge of origins in the mouths and actions of gods, it is acknowledging that human memory starts too late. The deepest beginning lies beyond the reach of ordinary witnesses, so the gods become memory holders. A hymn to Enki may preserve ideas of wisdom, craft, water, and order. A myth of Enlil may preserve the fear of authority, storm, destiny, and command. A story of Inanna may hold themes of power, desire, movement, and the dangerous transfer of sacred powers. A flood story may speak through divine decision because no human record could survive the full imagined rupture. The gods remember what people cannot prove. A grounded scholar would say this is how myth works. Gods personify forces, institutions, anxieties, and ideals. They give narrative form to social reality. A divine memory of beginnings is not evidence that gods recorded history. It is evidence that human communities use divine figures to think about origins beyond ordinary recall. That explanation is sound, yet the unusual tidbit appears when you notice how administrative these divine memories can be. The gods do not merely remember emotions, they remember arrangements. Who receives kingship? Which powers belong to which deity? Why humans work? Which city is chosen? What happens when noise, imbalance, or rebellion disturbs divine order? Their memory is structured, almost archival. That is why some speculative readers have imagined the gods as echoes of earlier ruling elites, culture bringers, or beings remembered through sacred exaggeration. Some connect the Anunnaki to this pattern, seeing them as a council whose decisions preserve a memory of an older command system. This interpretation cannot be established as historical fact, but it grows from a genuine feature of the texts. Divine memory often resembles institutional memory enlarged to cosmic scale. You move through the temple as evening deepens. Lamps are lit. Their flames tremble against plaster and brick. A priest murmurs words that may have been learned from an older tablet. A singer knows a hymn whose language may already feel ancient. A scribe records an offering because the god's household must be cared for correctly. Everything is done as if the present depends on remembering the proper pattern. That proper pattern is fragile in human hands. A ritual can be forgotten, a word can be miscopied, a temple can be neglected, a king can fail, a city can lose its god's favour. In Mesopotamian thought, disorder is always possible because order must be maintained. The gods know the order, but humans must enact it. This creates a tender imbalance. Humans need divine memory to keep living correctly, but divine memory reaches them only through imperfect channels: myths, rituals, omens, dreams, priests, scribes, statues, and inherited practices. Every channel can be misunderstood. Every sign needs interpretation. Every old text can break. The sacred past is powerful but not simple. The open, scholarly uncertainty lies in how ancient people understood divine stories across different contexts. Did ordinary workers hear them literally? Did temple scholars read them with layered theological sophistication? Did kings use them politically while priests guarded ritual meaning? Did different cities emphasize different versions because each city wished to place itself nearer the beginning? The surviving evidence suggests variety, but cannot recover every listener's mind. A story changes depending on who needs it. You imagine a farmer hearing that the gods made humans for labour. He may hear explanation. A priest may hear duty. A king may hear legitimacy. A scribe may hear tradition. A modern scholar may hear social ideology. A fringe reader may hear the echo of ancient management by beings beyond humanity. The same myth can carry all these responses, though not all with equal evidence. Clay does not control imagination. It only offers resistance. That resistance matters. It prevents the mystery from becoming careless. The texts do not allow a simple claim that gods were historical aliens, lost kings, or invented metaphors only. They are too varied for one flat answer. They belong to ritual, literature, theology, politics, fear, hope, and memory at once. Their power comes from that layering, and among those layers, divine memory remains central. In a world where human history can be erased by flood, fire, invasion, and neglect, the gods offer continuity. Their stories say that even when cities fail, the deeper order remains somewhere above or beneath the visible world. Kingship may descend again. Ritual may be restored. A ruined temple may be rebuilt on old foundations. A broken tradition may be copied by a later scribe. The gods remember better than men because the gods are how men imagine memory surviving men. That sentence moves quietly, but it carries the weight of the whole ancient archive. You look toward the stars above the temple court. Mesopotamian scholars watch the sky with great care, especially in later periods, developing rich traditions of omen reading, astronomy, and celestial interpretation. The heavens were not empty space to them. They were signs, order, warning, rhythm, and divine communication. The sky became another archive, one that did not crumble like clay. A star returns, a planet shifts, an eclipse unsettles. The heavens remember in cycles. This may be why the earliest civilization feels connected to something older than its own streets. Its records are earthly, but its authority points upward and downward, to heaven, to the deep waters, to the underworld, to the divine assembly, to the time before the flood. Human writing begins within this larger imagined memory field. The tablet is small. The remembered cosmos is immense. As night settles, the temple grows quieter. The offerings have been placed. The lamps burn steadily. A servant removes a vessel. A scribe sets a record with others in a clay-lined space. Somewhere beyond the walls, families settle into sleep, trusting that the city will still be there when dawn touches the canal. Trust may be the hidden center of civilization. Trust in walls, trust in water, trust in grain, trust in records, trust in rituals. Trust that the gods remember the order even when humans forget their lines. The first civilization was not first because it had no past. It was first to leave enough traces for you to feel how deeply it feared forgetting. It placed memory in clay, in temples, in kingship, in ritual, in myths, and in gods who stood outside the shortness of human life. If men forget, the gods may remember. If tablets break, the story may survive in another form. If cities vanish, the divine names may still move through later tongues. And if Sumer was never truly first, perhaps its own gods already knew that. They were the keepers of the beginning, too old for human records, too damaged for certainty, and too important to leave entirely unsaid. The lamp flame lowers, the statue watches without blinking. Beneath the word civilization, another civilization is always hiding. Not necessarily a lost empire with shining towers or impossible machines. Not a secret kingdom waiting intact below the desert. More often it is something quieter, harder to name, and more difficult to turn into a simple story. It is the long preparation beneath the visible achievement. It is the buried pattern under the word. You feel it as you walk across the plain at dawn. The city is still cool. Smoke rises from low roofs. A donkey shifts near a gate. A woman pours water into a jar. A child traces marks in dust with one finger, not yet writing, only copying the movement of someone older. Somewhere, a scribe opens a clay container of tablets. Somewhere, a priest checks the offerings. Somewhere, a canal worker looks at the waterline and decides whether the day will be easy or cruel. Everything appears ordinary, yet every ordinary act rests on older knowledge. This is the hidden structure beneath Sumer. Not one secret source, but many inherited systems woven together until they become almost invisible. Farming knowledge, canal knowledge, brick-making knowledge, ritual knowledge, counting knowledge, animal management, seed selection, brewing, weaving, trade routes, stone carving, seal making, temple service, social hierarchy, oral storytelling, seasonal timing, sacred geography. The city looks like a beginning only because its foundations are too deep to see. The quiet attention peak is simple. Civilization may begin long before anyone knows how to name it. Mainstream history can trace parts of this hidden pattern. Archaeology shows that earlier communities across Mesopotamia and the wider Near East developed agriculture, settled life, craft production, ritual spaces, storage practices, and exchange networks across thousands of years. By the time Sumerian cities became fully visible, many key elements of complex life had already been tested, adapted, and inherited. Sumer did not invent the human capacity for order, it intensified it. The unusual tidbit appears in how the Sumerian texts make this inheritance sacred. They do not merely say people learned, experimented, failed, and improved. They say powers descended. They say gods decreed. They say wisdom belonged to Enki, kingship came from heaven, and sages carried knowledge from an earlier age. This sacred language does not need to be literal to be meaningful. It turns deep inheritance into story. And story is how human beings protect what they cannot fully explain. You move through the city as the sun lifts. Mud bricks glow in soft gold. Reed mats dry on a wall. A potter turns clay with steady hands. His craft contains generations of correction. Too much water, and the vessel collapses. Too little, and it cracks. Too much heat, and it fails. Each good pot is a quiet archive of mistakes, no tablet records. Nearby, a brewer watches a vat of beer mash. Beer was central in Mesopotamian food culture, daily rationing, temple offerings, and social life. It was not a luxury only, it was nourishment, payment, pleasure, and ritual substance. To make it required skill, timing, ingredients, and repeated practice. No myth is needed to make brewing interesting, yet myth could still place such human skills within a divine order. That is how Sumer works again and again. The practical becomes sacred without ceasing to be practical. A temple ration list may name beer as a measurable commodity. A hymn may place abundance under divine favour. A worker may care mostly whether his portion is enough. A ruler may boast that the gods blessed his city. These are not separate realities. They are layers of one reality, each true in its own way. The hidden civilization beneath the visible one is made of layers like this. One layer is environmental. The southern Mesopotamian plain offered rich alluvial soil, but not easy life. Rainfall was limited. Irrigation mattered. Canals required planning and maintenance. Salinity could threaten fields. Rivers shifted. Marshes fed some communities while complicating others. Human order had to negotiate constantly with water and mud. Another layer is institutional. As settlements grew, some groups gained authority to organize labor, store goods, manage offerings, and direct resources. Temples and later palaces did not simply dominate because people enjoyed being managed. They emerged because coordination solved real problems, even while creating new inequalities. Another layer is symbolic. People needed reasons for obedience, work, kingship, ritual, and sacrifice. Myths provided those reasons. They made social structures feel connected to the architecture of the cosmos. That connection could comfort, control, inspire, or frighten. No single layer explains everything. The open scholarly uncertainty is how these layers interacted in the earliest phases. Did temple authority grow primarily from ritual prestige, economic coordination, elite competition, or community need? Did irrigation require centralized management from early on? Or did centralization grow more gradually and unevenly? Did writing emerge mainly from temple administration, broader economic practices, or mixed institutional pressures? Scholars continue to refine these questions as new evidence and methods appear. The machine can be partly reconstructed, but not fully. You imagine gathering scattered pieces on a reed mat, a clay token, a broken seal, a charred grain seed, a fish bone, a bit of copper, a bead from far away, a child's practice tablet, a temple brick, a cylinder seal, and a fragment of myth. None of these alone explains Sumer. Together, they begin to hum. That hum is the sound of systems touching. Some people search for one dramatic hidden civilization beneath Sumer because the visible achievement feels too complete. But perhaps the deeper truth is more unsettling. The hidden civilization was not one place. It was the accumulated intelligence of many communities, many experiments, and many vanished generations. Its builders did not know they were building Sumer. They were solving hunger, water, storage, death, memory, and fear. Later, the scribes gave those solutions names. Gods, decrees, powers, kingship, wisdom, fate. This does not make the myths false, it makes them human. A divine gift may be the sacred memory of an invention whose inventor has disappeared. A god of wisdom may carry the shape of generations of craft knowledge. A pre-flood sage may be the mythic face of older, teaching traditions. A descending kingship may be the theological form of authority becoming institutional. One cautious reading might suggest that Sumerian myth preserves the awe of receiving civilization from an unknown depth. Not from nowhere, from unknown depth. That phrase feels right as the day warms. The city becomes louder, wheels creak, animals call. A clerk complains softly about a missing measure. A worker laughs at something near the canal. Life is not solemn all the time, even under gods. Civilization includes boredom, hunger, jokes, errors, repairs, and people pretending not to notice when an official is confused. The ancient world was mysterious, but it was also ordinary. That ordinary quality is important because it keeps the mystery from drifting too far away. The hidden pattern beneath Sumer was lived by real people. Their choices were practical before they became mythic. They learned where to dig, when to plant, how to count, whom to trust, which rituals calmed fear, and which stories made suffering bearable. The first civilization, then, may be less like a sudden invention and more like a threshold. On one side are thousands of years of unwritten experiment. On the other side are tablets, cities, kings, temples, and texts that can still be read. The threshold matters because crossing it changes memory, but it does not erase the road behind it. You stand at that threshold as evening returns. The city glows with lamplight. The canal reflects the first stars. A tablet dries beside a doorway. Under the tablet lies the table. Under the table lies the floor. Under the floor lie older floors. Under the city lie older settlements, older skills, older rituals, older seeds, older fears, and older dreams of order. Civilization is never only what rises, it is also what supports the rising. And beneath Sumer's clay voice, you can still feel that deeper support, unnamed, unfinished, half lost. Not first in the way a title is first, but first in the way roots are first. Hidden, necessary, and mostly silent. The last tablet is not dramatic. It lies in the quiet like any other piece of ancient clay, small, brown, cracked, and patient. One edge is broken away. A line begins cleanly, then disappears into damage. A name survives. A number survives. A divine title survives. The rest is absence. You lean closer, as if nearness could restore what time removed. This is how the story of Sumer leaves you. Not with a sealed answer, but with a surface marked by human effort and interrupted by loss. The tablet is readable enough to invite you in, broken enough to keep you humble. It belongs perfectly to a civilization that seems both first and not first, both origin and inheritance, both clear voice and half-heard echo. The clay does not shout, it waits. By now, the mystery has softened into something deeper than a single claim. Sumer was among the earliest civilizations to leave a rich written record. Its cities, temples, scribes, administrators, myths, hymns, seals, and king lists transformed the way human beings could be remembered. For historians, this is its great power. Through Sumer, the ancient world becomes unusually legible. Yet legibility is not the same as absolute beginning. That is the quiet attention peak. The first voice we can clearly hear may already be speaking from the middle of a much older song. The mainstream historical picture remains steady. Sumerian civilization grew from long developments in southern Mesopotamia and the wider ancient Near East. Farming, settlement, ritual, craft specialization, exchange, storage, and social complexity all preceded the great written cities. Writing emerged through administrative need, then expanded into literature, theology, law-like practice, and royal memory. Temples and institutions gave structure to urban life. Myths gave that structure sacred depth. Nothing here requires a forced secret, but the Sumerian texts are not flat. They preserve a world that thought of order as descending, not merely rising. Kingship comes from heaven. Wisdom gathers around Enki and the deep waters. The Anunnaki appear within systems of divine authority. The flood divides time. Sages carry knowledge from an earlier age. Humans are made within a structure of labour. Cities are not random clusters. They are sacred households, chosen places, nodes in a map of divine meaning. These patterns do not prove a hidden advanced civilization behind Sumer. They do suggest that Sumerian memory pointed behind itself. Some have wondered whether these traditions hold distorted echoes of earlier cultures, lost teachers, environmental catastrophes, or social systems whose original forms vanished before writing became common. That possibility should remain cautious. The evidence is incomplete, and speculation becomes weak when it pretends to be certainty. Still, the question is worth keeping because it arises naturally from the texts themselves. Why does the first readable civilization so often speak as if civilization was received? You let that question rest beside the tablet. A scribe may have copied the line from an older model. That model may have been copied from another. Before the first clay version, perhaps the story lived in voices, in temple ritual, in the memory of elders, in songs spoken near water, in schoolrooms not yet formal, in offerings placed at shrines whose earliest meanings were already fading. The written text feels like a beginning because it is where you can finally read. But the story may have travelled a long way before reaching the stylus. The tablet is the shore, not the spring. An open, scholarly uncertainty remains around the depth of that spring. How old were the traditions behind the written myths? How much of Sumerian sacred memory reflects earlier prehistoric belief? How much was shaped by temple politics, scribal education, and royal ideology? How should impossible reign lengths, divine decrees, flood divisions, and culture-bringing sages be read? Symbolically, politically, ritually, historically, or all at once? A careful answer refuses to flatten them. Ancient texts often work through many layers at the same time. A myth can legitimize a king while preserving older memory. A flood story can reflect real environmental fear while becoming cosmic theology. A divine council can mirror human institutions while giving them sacred ancestry. A culture hero can express scholarly pride while echoing forgotten lines of transmission. The past does not separate itself for convenience. You walk one last time through the imagined city. The hour is late. Mud brick walls hold the day's remaining warmth. A dog moves between shadows. Reed mats hang limp in the cooling air. A lamp burns in a doorway where someone is still awake. Beyond the houses, the temple rises dark against the stars, not enormous by modern standards, yet immense in meaning. The city is alive because systems are holding. Water moves through canals. Grain waits in storage. Offerings have been made. Records have been pressed. Workers will rise again. Priests will perform what must be performed. Scribes will correct students. Seals will roll over clay. Kings will seek divine support. Stories will be copied because forgetting is always near. This is civilization as vigilance. Not a single invention, not one bright moment, a long practice of resisting collapse. That may be the deepest reason Sumer feels both ancient and familiar. Its people understood that order is not permanent, it must be renewed. Canals must be cleared, temples rebuilt, texts recopied, children trained, gods honoured, fields watched, names written before they vanish. A civilization survives by repeating itself carefully enough that the next generation can continue, and still, repetition fails. Cities fall, languages change, gods lose worshippers, archives break, rivers move, empires arrive and leave, a sacred city becomes a mound, a king becomes a line, a worker becomes a ration entry, a myth becomes a fragment. An entire world becomes something a stranger studies under museum glass. That is not only tragic, it is also why the surviving clay feels miraculous. The unusual fringe imagination often wants the final tablet to reveal everything. A hidden map, a forbidden message, a clear statement that Sumer inherited civilization from an unknown power. But the real ancient record is subtler and more haunting. It reveals enough to show depth, then breaks before certainty. It invites wonder, then asks for restraint. The mystery remains because the evidence remains human. Human things are partial. You look again at the last tablet. The broken line does not say whether Sumer was truly first. It says something more useful. It says that the first readable world was already thinking about older worlds, divine origins, lost ages, and the fragile survival of order. It says that beginnings are often constructed from remembered fragments. It says that history begins wherever evidence becomes strong enough to hold. But life began its preparations much earlier. The city outside grows quiet. The river keeps moving. Somewhere below the mound are older floors. Somewhere behind the myth are older voices. Somewhere beneath the word civilization are hands planting seed, shaping clay, cutting reeds, counting goods, watching floods, and telling stories before anyone wrote them down. So perhaps the first civilization was never truly first. Perhaps it was the first to leave its unfinished question in clay. The night settles gently over the ancient plain. The last tablet cools beside a low lamp, its broken edge holding shadow. No hand reaches for the stylus now. No voice corrects the line. The city has become still, and the river moves beyond the walls with its slow, dark patience. You do not need to solve the question tonight. It's enough to let it rest where the old scribes left it, between memory and loss, between the written sign and the silence underneath. Sumer remains there, luminous and incomplete, the first clear voice rising from a depth it did not fully explain. The mud brick walls fade into darkness. The reeds bend softly near the water. Somewhere, grain sleeps in a sealed jar. Somewhere, a temple step keeps the warmth of vanished feet. Somewhere, beneath floor after floor, older lives remain without names, supporting the city that later ages would call first. The clay does not answer everything. It only endures, and maybe that's why it feels so peaceful now. The mystery no longer needs to be sharp. It can become part of the quiet. A river moving through darkness, a star reflected in shallow water, a line of cuneiform half broken and still beautiful. You can leave the tablet where it lies. You can let the museum lights dim, the excavation dust settle, the old gods return to their deep silence. The question remains unread, but not abandoned. It waits in clay, in soil, in stories, in the soft space before sleep. Perhaps the beginning was only the first surviving page. Perhaps something older breathed beneath it. And perhaps, for tonight, that's enough. The river continues. The clay cools. The unread line stays open. End of script. Good night.